Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy. My name is Michelle Stone, and this is episode 71, which is one polygamy denier's response to Bill Reel, RFM, Lindsay Hansen Park, Brian Buchanan, and Brian Hales. Thank you for joining us as I accept this challenge to argue against Joseph's polygamy. It has been an extremely stressful couple of days, deciding to do this video, deciding how to do this video, and then preparing to do it. I really felt like I needed to do a video, but I wanted to get a panel together of all of the best experts and scholars so I could just sit here and have them say all the brilliant things. And then I kept feeling that wasn't right and felt like I needed to just do it by myself, which I did not want to do for several reasons. I'm so hesitant to do this video. It is so stressful to me. First, I really want to avoid contention. It'd be way better to sit here with a group and let them say all of the things than to be here by myself. I am so uncomfortable sticking my neck out like this, making myself a target to this extent. I know that I'm not the greatest authority of this at all. I'm actually relatively new to the study specifically of Joseph's polygamy. I mean, I've been looking into polygamy for years, and I have been looking into the history of polygamy, but that just hasn't been my focus, as those who have watched my podcast know. I've been intentionally just setting aside the discussion of Joseph because it just was too messy, and I didn't like it. I didn't like getting in like that. So I feel like there are other people who could do this much better, and I feel a lot of risk that people are going to mock me. I don't like how that feels, and I also know that there's somewhat limited potential for good and quite a bit greater potential for harm, it feels like to me. I know that people who are just adamantly in the Joseph was a polygamist camp and you're an idiot if you think otherwise, I don't expect to convince those people. I don't think that, I don't know that that's going to happen, just like you don't usually convince people who are adamantly opposed to everything you say. I hope that you that feel that way will listen and consider what I say, but I'm not necessarily trying to convince you. On the other hand, I am very aware of the risk that I could say something stupid or be not fully informed on something, and something I say could be taken and turned into a straw man for my entire argument. And even worse than that, for like anyone who believes Joseph wasn't a polygamist, you can take something I said and try to use it to undermine everyone. So I'm aware of those risks. I also just, like I said, I don't want to be claiming, I'm not claiming to speak for everybody in this camp. I am speaking for myself. Maybe that's part of why I'm doing it by myself. But despite all of that, I think most of all, I just feel like so scared. It's 5-on-1, and more than that, like I was okay. I'll get into this a little bit, but I was okay changing my mind on polygamy. Those who have followed my podcast know I used to strongly, fervently, devoutly believe in polygamy, and I actually used to speak quite a bit and included that. And so the people who used to really love me hate me now, right? Because I've changed my mind on whether or not polygamy was of God through my study, right? And that was, I lost a lot when I did that, but that's okay. It was truth. This feels harder because in my engagements, the pro-polygamist community is quite a bit smaller than the anti-Joseph community. And the anti-Joseph community is big, and from my interactions can be really mean, right? Can really mock and be pretty arrogant and impatient. I'm sure we all can do that. I've just received it on this end. So it's hard to want to step into that. So with, all that being said, I hope people won't respond that way. Maybe that's part of why I'm saying it, but I'm sure that some will. But still, I feel like I should do it. These are some of my reasons for doing it. I feel a lot of sympathy and some responsibility for the people who are allowing themselves to start to consider this point, right? In that new place of going, wait, I'm shaken. I don't know what to believe right now. And they're starting to maybe think, well, I hope that I've already helped people who have allowed themselves to believe that polygamy was never of God. This is another step to think that Joseph didn't practice polygamy, didn't teach polygamy, only fought polygamy, right? That feels like a scarier step because it's so loud. The voices are so loud telling us that he absolutely did. I feel some responsibility for those people who have just started to allow themselves to consider that and maybe now feel like I must be an idiot. I'm an idiot. How could I dare think that? I feel like I want to throw them a lifeline. I want to let them see a different perspective. Let them know, no, you're not an idiot. It's not as clear cut of a case as people want to claim it is at all. In fact, I feel as strongly in the other direction as people feel. I feel as strongly convinced that Joseph wasn't a polygamist as people feel that he was a polygamist. So I want to share that information so that people who are hearing only a conspiracy theorist or a polygamy denier or someone who was only just massively desperate and motivated to believe this way would possibly believe it. That's not true, and I want to share that. So, and then I'm hoping that's my first audience that I'm gearing this toward are those of you who are feeling a little shaken up by some of the things you're hearing on the other side. My other audience is, I hope, those who have very little patience for polygamy deniers, as I'm just going to call myself because that's what I've been labeled. And my hope is that both of these podcasts expressed a lot of both surprise and concern at how many people are starting to believe that Joseph wasn't a polygamist. I did RFM a disservice. I think last week I said he said you can't swing a stick, and he was much more clever than that. He said you can't swing a dead cat without hitting someone that thinks Joseph wasn't a polygamist. And he's right. And that is growing and growing and growing. And I want to help the people who cannot understand that at all, hopefully understand it, right? So that those of you who think that that's just insane and ludicrous can, if you can understand better why I and others think that way, you can hopefully speak to it better and respond to it better, right? I was going to make this analogy a little later on, but there's another thing that's been happening in our community, right? All of the people leaving the church and everyone leaving the church, the more that you're told, oh, you just wanted to sin, or, oh, you never had a testimony, or, right? You're told your reasons that you're leaving, and they're all something bad about you, right? Does that feel very good? And is it very helpful? No, it's not. I'm feeling the exact same thing in reverse right now. That's what I feel I'm being told from the people who have left the church and think Joseph is all bad. I just am so motivated. I have so much bias. I can't think clearly, or I just had some other, right? And it feels just as offensive to me in this context as it did in that context when I was struggling with the church and people would say that. Also, when you are, learning all of these things that you learned about church history and it's shaking your foundation and you are starting to lose your belief in the church, and people, first of all, tell you all of the reasons that you're doing that. And then they start quoting general authorities at you, or quoting scripture, or telling you all the reasons you need to stay in the church, while at the same time refusing to look at what you've looked at, refusing to try to understand your paradigm. It's not very helpful, is it? Not like, I hope you guys can relate, like whether or not you agree with me, I hope you will at least listen to what I'm saying about the same way that those arguments resonated with me then when I was struggling with the church is the same way these arguments are resonating now. I'm being accused of things, told what my motivations are, and then given information that does not feel credible to me by people who I don't feel have done the work that I have done to understand why it's not credible. So I hope that I'm setting that out pretty strong in the beginning, but I think it's an important thing to consider and to recognize and consider, right? If you want to be able to speak to us effectively, you have to do it a different way, do a little more work. And I guess I would say whatever advice you would give to people who were staunchly in the church and when you were struggling with your testimony, maybe give that same advice to yourself now to consider. It's kind of like a role reversal. Just like we had such a huge tide of people leaving the church, we now have such a huge tide of people coming to believe that Joseph wasn't a polygamist, right? And it might be beneficial to try to understand better. So that is my goal here. I won't necessarily convince you, but I'm hoping to at least help you understand so we can have better conversations. Okay, so first of all, I do want to go into a couple of things. I really like brain science. I've studied it for a long time. I've been on different sides of many different issues in my life, so I've come to really understand this both through study and through personal experience. So this was awesome. I just happened to find these when I had this idea. These are literally polygamy sunglasses, right? These are polygamy glasses. This style is called polygamy, which I thought was just so perfect for the point I'm trying to make. Unfortunately, these amazing glasses aren't available anymore. And even if they were, I wouldn't want to spend $525 to get them. So you instead are going to have to put up with my husband's sunglasses that I'm borrowing. So these are my polygamy lenses. You know, everyone knows about perspective, right? And bias. And I have to tell you, when I am hearing your presentation, I am seeing your polygamy glasses that I feel like you are viewing everything through. So that's what I wanted to bring up. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this because I think it's important to get into. As I said, I like brain science. So I'm just going to show you this one thing. Our brains have to make sense of the world, right? We have to fill in the missing pieces. That's how our brains work. That's why they're so great. So they're all doing that all the time, and we can't function if they don't. That's just how it is. And even when you know your brain, what I should say is, even when you know that your perception is incorrect, you can't stop the perception from happening. So let me show you this little clip that hopefully some of you are already familiar with.
We'll take a look at the illusion again. If you want, try holding up one of your hands and block this section of the image. If you're having trouble seeing it, we'll help you out. Crazy, right?
Okay, is that amazing? Like, look at it again. Even when you know, you can't stop your brain from seeing it the way that it is going to perceive it. And so that's how life is, right? And assuming that you're the only person that doesn't have a perspective or that it doesn't have a bias is dangerous. We all have bias. We all need bias. It's baked in. So on that point, these are the monogamy sunglasses in the same line, right? So also not available, also $525. So instead, I'm borrowing my daughter's. Oh, there's a horrible glare. I apologize. But these are my funky, kind of embarrassing. Everyone's going to make fun of me for wearing these monogamy lenses, right? I admit that I am wearing these. I will tell you, I spend a lot of time looking at the world through these till I finally noticed, oh, I think I have some polygamy glasses on, and started to kind of go back and forth and consider the view, right? And that has been my process to coming to where I finally am comfortable just owning and claiming my monogamy lenses, hoping that people who think that they're goofy looking won't be too cruel when they make fun of me. So I hope that demonstration was helpful. I liked it. The fact that I found polygamy and monogamy sunglasses meant I absolutely had to do it. So I actually think that this bias that is baked into creation, that I think is what Paul is talking about when he says we see through a glass darkly, right? In this world, we cannot escape bias. And the danger, as I said, is assuming that since you can see someone else's bias, therefore you don't have one. And that's really part of what I want to talk about. I just want to hopefully try to let people see both sets of glasses, of lenses, be aware of both frames of bias so that they can consider looking at the world for a minute through a different frame, right? Through different glasses. Michael Shermer is someone who I don't agree with him on everything, definitely, but there are some things I really like. That I'll link a TED Talk below that he gives where he talks about signal to noise ratio. And I like this as well, right? Signal to noise ratio is developing AI was so difficult because, but we learned so much about how our perception works, right? Things we just take for granted. Again, we take our perception for granted because we don't know what's happening, what our brain is doing to help us make sense of the world. But the signal to noise ratio is what matters, what do I need to make sense of, what is irrelevant and I should just ignore, right? If the signal to noise ratio is set too high, you see things that aren't really there, right? You see patterns. That's where a lot of paranoia comes from. Everyone's out to get me. I'm thinking all of these things are happening, right? When it's set too low, you totally miss things that that other people see as important, right? So that's what I think happens. I think when we put the polygamy lenses on, we see everything as evidence of polygamy, right? Something that someone with monogamy lenses or with not even involved in the discussion might see as just noise, as irrelevant. People with polygamy lenses see as evidence of polygamy, and vice versa, right? People that in the polygamy camp just think is irrelevant or not that important, people in the monogamy camp think is really, really important, and it means looks like very strong evidence for their perspective. And so I think that's what we need to be aware of. When we are wearing different glasses, different things look important to us. Different things make sense to us. So that's what I'm saying. The best I think that we can do, I think personally that God made us this way. This is all baked in for a reason. And I think it's so that we can learn to love one another, right? So that we can learn to treat each other with respect, even if I cannot even begin to figure out what lenses you are wearing, right? At least I can recognize, well, I have lenses too. They have lenses too. How can I be kind and respectful as I try to see the world through their eyes, and then try to engage to help them see the world through my eyes? Because maybe I think my idea is better, or maybe I'll learn something in how their frame is better. So anyway, that's my goal here. I hope that makes sense. I also want to acknowledge that as I am talking and sharing my perspective and answering each of these issues, many of the Joseph was absolutely a polygamist and you're an idiot if you think otherwise people will likely feel massive frustration, want to throw things at the screen, turn it off, be really, really angry. And if I make a really good point, their brains will immediately start going, well, but what about, right? I want to express that's called cognitive dissonance, right? Something we all should be really quite familiar with. And it's caused by our motivated reasoning because it's shaking up our lenses, right? I want to let you know I sat through both of these presentations a couple of times so that I could get every point in order to respond to them. And I just breathed and dealt with it, turned it off when I needed to, when it got really frustrating, and came back to it. So I understand, and we all have to deal with that because cognitive cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning and bias are, again, baked into the cake, part of our lives, unavoidable, just like our bias, our lenses are, our perspective. So that's not unique to you, and it's not because I'm wrong. It's because we have different lenses on and we're trying to find a way to see through each other's lenses. So that's what my request is, rather than just give in to the cognitive dissonance and assume. And that also, cognitive dissonance also makes you want to call people names. That's part of why you just want to mock people, is because that feels better than going, okay, this really feels awful to try to see what they're saying, but I don't know a better way to do it. So that's what I'll say. I do want to say, for those who are still objecting, our biases usually can be so strong that we are not at all aware they exist. So some of you will be familiar with this famous picture. I love this picture. It's an award-winning picture. And obviously, it's just this kind of normal picture of camels in the desert, right? Pretty basic, pretty normal. So I want to now switch it and give a little bit different perspective. See if you see something different, right? When you zoom in, or when you do a closer examination, you realize that what you are actually seeing aren't camels. They are the shadows of camels from a picture taken from the air, right? Isn't that amazing? I think this is such a good demonstration of exactly what I am talking about. It's so easy to see things. And of course, everyone knows that's camels. How can you be so blind, so dumb? It's camels, right? And what I'm trying to say is, maybe on some of these issues, I've zoomed in a little more closely to where I can see, oh, those are shadows. Those are shadows of something else. And maybe the same is this, maybe it's true in reverse. So I think it's useful to have this dialogue in a respectful way, recognizing that we just have different biases, right? And I do want to say that while I think it's essential to keep in mind always that I might have a blind spot. I might have a bias. Absolutely. I shouldn't say I might. I do. I do have tons of bias that I'm not familiar with, that I'm not aware of, right? But I can, once I have thought these were shadows for a long time in this picture and then zoomed in, once I've seen that they're camels, then I can eliminate thinking that once I've seen their shadows, if I thought they were camels, when I've zoomed in, I can eliminate that and go, oh, I have done the work there, so I know that those are shadows, not camels, right? So there are things we can check off, but there might still be another perspective that I'm not aware of that would throw the whole thing on its head again. So I don't think it's true that we can't know anything. I think the mistake is thinking we know more than we do and being closed-minded to what other people might think, right? If we're having a discussion and I've already eliminated those as camels, I can show you how I see them and how they're shadows, right? So I think that that's useful to do, but then maybe you can show me something else that I hadn't considered. So relating this back to Joseph's polygamy, when we have this huge pile of evidence, all of these things that have been amassed for well over a century, it seems so obvious when we look at them. Of course, they mean that Joseph was a polygamist, just like, of course, those are camels, right? And so that's just what I'm wanting to hopefully help people understand, is that when you consider these different lenses, everything shifts and you see things in a very different way, and two critical facts emerge. I shouldn't call them facts, but central points emerge that I have come to strongly believe. First is that Joseph wasn't a polygamist. He didn't teach or practice polygamy. In fact, he fought against it. I know that sounds crazy, but that's because there's also piece number two. The second piece that emerges is there were many dedicated efforts to paint him as a polygamist. It was a dedicated effort, in my opinion, by two main groups, right? These completely disparate groups that had this one huge thing in common. The first group were various people during his life who opposed and hated him and used claims of his polygamy as a smear against him. So we can call those people antagonists, or we could call them anti-Josephites, right? If we want to use the Book of Mormon vernacular, we can take our pick, either one. And then the second group is the people who, after Joseph's death, led what would become the Utah Church and centered their gospel on polygamy and used the claims of Joseph's polygamy to justify their doctrine, right? So we can call those people apologists, polygamy apologists, or we could call them Brighamites, right? So we have the antagonists and the apologists, or the anti-Josephites and the Brighamites. Those are the two groups that are so different in so many things and yet seem to be completely united in this one thing, in the fact that Joseph was a polygamist. And that's what's so amazing, is that those were the two groups clear back from Joseph Smith's life, and they're the exact same groups today, right? In fact, it's incredible that these two podcasts came out one after the other, 2 days in a row, with this exact dynamic, right? The first one that came out was Mormon Discussions, which all of those people have rejected Joseph Smith and see him as a pretty bad guy, right? And they are I think, very committed to this picture they have of Joseph Smith as a bad guy, but that's the people I'm trying to talk to, right? And then the second day, Brian Hales episode came out, which was the apologist, right? Which was Joseph was a polygamist, and it's what God wanted him to do, and all of the other prophets lined up behind him in a good way, right? So it's so interesting to me. And again, we have this amazing agreement between these two camps. In fact, I'm sure there's nothing to it at all, but it is interesting that those podcasts came out one day after the other, and that so many of the arguments are the same, and they rely on exactly the same sources, discard exactly the same sources, prioritize the same points, discount the same points, and in fact, they both, I would say, they share their proof texting, right? I think probably all of us are guilty of proof texting. I try really hard. I'm sure many of us do, but I sure see it in these presentations. What looks like proof texting to me, as well as a lot of circular reasoning. And so we'll get there. But I want to give one example of the congruence between these two groups that I just find amazing. Some of you will remember that when Brian Hales was on my podcast, I brought up Doctrine and Covenants 101, the one that was removed from the Doctrine and Covenants in 1876 when Section 132 was added, right? And when I read it, inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in the case of death. Brian pointed out that there's kind of some coded language possibly in there, that it says that but is like this magical but that changes the meaning. So when it says, we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, it means that saying you should have one wife doesn't really mean one wife. You have to say but to make it really mean one. So that struck me as, I can't even explain it well because it's so silly in my mind. It's so ridiculous. And when Brian told me that, I just was like, wow. And to my amazement, RFM, who I generally really like and respect, no hate RFM, but really you made this point. It astonished me. And like, one of my favorite comments that someone made is, if I tell my child, you can have one cookie, if my children are begging, please, can we have cookies? You can have one cookie. I really mean, you can have at least one cookie. You can have all the cookies. I have to say, you can have but one cookie in order to make myself clear. I think what I probably would need to do is tell my sons, you can have one cookie, and tell my daughters, you can have but one cookie. And I'm sure they would all know exactly what I mean, right? Like, that is they agree on that. That is shocking to me and amazing, and is an example of how deep I see this desperation to try to make these things say what they don't say in order to paint a picture that I think we will see is shadows of camels, not actual camels, if we get into it. So anyway, there we go. And all of the agreement. One other thing I want to say that I find surprising is that the antagonists, the anti-Josephites, really tend to claim that the church lies about everything, right? They discount the church on so many things. And, fair, there are some valid points there. We do have some problems. However, it's amazing to me that they completely agree with and accept all of the church's sources and interpretations. And, there was even a lot of quoting from the, in my opinion, very biased descriptions and explanations on the Joseph Smith papers, or in the, the prefixes, the header to the scriptures. Like, I was like, this is amazing. This is the one area where they're like, nope, the church is right. The church is true. The church is right. So I think it's really interesting. So both of these two groups, back in Joseph's day and today, maybe even more so today, unite against a third group, which they have labeled polygamy deniers, right? That's the group that I now fall into. And again, showing their similarity, both groups use that term, polygamy deniers. From the first time I heard that was from Brian Hales. I think he came up with the term in, let's be honest, in his effort to demean, mock, shame, and silence people who don't believe in Joseph's polygamy. It's he likes to claim now that it's not a pejorative, which I think we can all agree is ridiculous, since it's in the exact same vein as Holocaust deniers, climate deniers, science deniers, flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, right? On and on and on. We can go on forever. That's what those terms are intended to do. And so, like most of these terms, the term polygamy denier is both inaccurate and quite meaningless, because no one is denying that polygamy happened, right? So its only purpose is as a pejorative. The question isn't whether or not polygamy happened. The question is, who is responsible for it, Joseph Smith or Brigham Young? And as I said last week in my discussion with Jeremy Hoop, which I hope all of you who have not dove in deeply to this topic will watch, because I think it speaks to some really important things that that will help you understand this perspective again. I get really frustrated. That's part of my when watching things, when people set themselves up and claim to be like defenders of women, and I get really heated about that, because it implies it's kind of like using your woman card to say people who don't agree with me aren't real women or don't really love women. I don't like that at all. I also feel very strongly that if we want to speak on behalf of women and recognize people in general, but also women who have been victimized, we need to hold the right perpetrators accountable. It does not give a woman justice when you put the wrong guy in prison for rape, right? You have to get the right guy. So I think that it's really circular reasoning, as well as sort of this weird manipulation to kind of set yourself up and say, I want to help the women and believe the women, and therefore anyone who wants to do that has to see it this way. I really, really strongly disagree with that. And also, if we care about women today, I have had several conversations ongoing with Tanya Toole since my conversation I had with her on the podcast. And one of the things that she said to me is, if this is true, that Joseph wasn't a polygamist, that it didn't start with him, and if you can get this information out there, it could help so many women and children. It could help them today, right now, the women that are suffering. Please watch those 2 episodes with Flora Jessup and with Tanya Toole. And she was very free to express, if this is true, it would be a game changer. And so I think that's an important thing to consider if we want to talk about women, to, have respect for Tanya Toole and listen to what she is saying. Again, not motivated reasoning, but maybe there is good to considering this perspective that you hadn't even thought about. Maybe it could help save more people. And I think that that's something worth considering. So that is the point I'm trying to make. The question isn't, did polygamy happen or did it not? The question is, was it Joseph Smith or Brigham Young? Who is responsible? That's what we want to get into. So I'm very briefly, I think I am going to get into the videos as quickly as I can, but I think that this setup, this framing is important so people can understand as I am answering the point-by-point details, which I'm going to do later on in the video. So please stick with me. But when I'm wearing my polygamy lenses, right, a whole different list of priorities emerges that are huge, overwhelming, these massive concerns that I think have not been at all adequately addressed. They are generally either completely ignored or just dismissed away in ways that I find to be not only not compelling, but actually concerning, right? And so when in the polygamy lenses, different things seem more important, but I'm going to try and let you see through my monogamy lenses what answers I need to be able to put my polygamy lenses back on, right? Or at least what things you could speak to help me be more convinced, more compelled, right? So I'm going to very briefly outline each of these. Each of these has hours of content dedicated to it. I'm sorry, we are having a massive thunderstorm right now, so if it's loud, that's why. We'll pretend it's the gentle rain sounds that can help calm all of that cognitive dissonance discomfort. I've been trying to wait out this rain, but it is not letting up. I kept going until the thunder started pounding, but looks like we're just doing a podcast with background noise. So anyway, I'm going to, as I said, very briefly cover each of these topics, and I would recommend digging in deeper to each of these things because I'm not going to do them justice. There is just so much information available. I strongly recommend all of Rob Fotheringham's excellent videos. Whitney Horning's books are a great resource. Of course, I think my podcast is valuable, and there are some other projects that I'm super excited about that are forthcoming that I think that if you guys think this is growing fast to this point, I think you have not seen anything yet for what is going to happen. I'm not a prophet, so that's not a prophecy, simply a prediction from what I understand and what I am seeing and the evidence before me. So again, here are the top issues for me with my monogamy lenses. The number one, I'm sure you can guess, is no children. There are no children from Joseph with anybody than Emma. I want to do an entire episode on this, but just really quickly again to try to spell it out. Polygamist leaders have many children with many wives. It follows the pattern, right? In the polygamist cults, David Koresh, Father Yod, then, we have Warren Jeffs, Brigham Young, and every single other polygamist leader. They all have many, many children. And I agree that polygamy is about power. I think it's about self-glorification to an exalted degree, right? It is absolutely about power. Part of that is power to have sex. Saying polygamy is about power doesn't remove the fact that polygamy is also about sex and about having children. And Mormon polygamy, more than any other polygamy, was about having children, right? It's a big deal. Both of these podcasts, amazingly, didn't even include this in the presentation. For both of them, it was the last question that happened to come in, the very last question, and they addressed it, and I thought it was not addressed well. So I think that we need to not only look at Joseph not having children, but also Hiram did not have any children, or many, many other of the top leaders that would have been, well, we call them polygamy insiders. I would think it's, well, Brian Hales has labeled them polygamy insiders. We have polygamy deniers and polygamy insiders, right? I have a different term, which is the polygamy conspirators, right? I made that second point of what I believe a very careful effort to paint Joseph as a polygamist. The polygamy conspirators were the ones who had children, right? There were a few that we think were possibly born before Joseph's death, but not very many. All of a sudden, Joseph is gone, and all of these polygamous leaders that I would call the polygamy conspirators all of a sudden started having babies left and right? They were in the exact same situation that Joseph was in Nauvoo. They had every bit as much stress, every bit as much danger and opposition from the mobs. In fact, they were being chased out, right? It had to be secret from the people still. They didn't have time. I mean, look at how many times Brigham Young had to come back and forth, and he was moving like to far west as well as to the Salt Lake Valley. And like to claim that the circumstances were so much more favorable for Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and others than they were for Joseph Smith doesn't make sense to me. Someone has to explain that to me, because what I see as the limiting factor of children was Joseph Smith. When Joseph Smith was alive, I have only found evidence of 2 possible children. Augusta Cobb was the woman who left her husband and came with Brigham and married him and had a little baby boy that passed away, and his name was Brigham. And then there's a similar story with Heber C. Kimball that it's slipping my mind, but we'll have to get into it. Those are the only 2 that I think are quite suspicious before Joseph's death. But as soon as Joseph dies, all of a sudden, babies start popping up. So that's the question. Was the limiting factor the mobs, the secrecy, the busyness, the women everywhere, or was it Joseph Smith? I think that's a valuable question to consider. I haven't heard a good answer. I also think that I want to have a friend come on. He has done a statistical analysis of the likelihood of a polygamous leader not having children, using very conservative numbers for what we claim Joseph Smith did. And it doesn't hold up well. Also, may I point out that we can take this point of no children and add it as another huge point of evidence in the conspiracy claim, in the effort to paint Joseph as a polygamy camp, because we have many claims of children, right? We know the DNA testing was done for the 8 best cases, including Josephine Lyons, which turned out to be dishonest. And I will argue forever that to claim, it gets me frustrated with everything I'm going to read, right? To claim, well, it shows that it could have been. She didn't know who the father was. No, that doesn't work. She didn't say, your father might have been Joseph Smith. She said, your father was Joseph Smith, right? She said that matter-of-factly. We claimed that forever as one of the strongest evidences of Joseph's polygamy. Of course, look, we have a child. I will tell you this, if there was one child, that's the smoking gun. If there is one child, game over. We at least know that he was unfaithful, if not completely polygamist. If there was one child, I would think Joseph was a polygamist. You can't overcome that. But at the same time, you got to do a lot better to overcome the fact that there are no children. That is huge. Okay, I'm going to go on. I think I have something like 7 points. I don't know how much I'm trying to hurry. So the second one is the relationship between Joseph and Emma. And I will add to that, Emma's calling as the Relief Society president. So I did an episode on Joseph and Emma, which is the first one that started to really make me think Joseph wasn't a polygamist. That's where I got really brave enough to say that publicly for the first time, even though it wasn't the focus of my episode. But just a couple of things to go over quickly. I really hope that people will watch that episode. So Emma got pregnant pretty much every 2 years, right? As people who are fertile in a functioning and hopefully happy marriage do, right? That's generally what happens, and that was their pattern, even though he was gone so much and in prison so much, and even with all of the stress and all of those things happening, the homelessness, the stress Emma was under, both of them, she managed to get pregnant every they managed to get pregnant every 2 years. We'll say that. Also, I want to point out that this goes up until the time of his death. Emma was pregnant at the time of his death, and no other woman was. I think people don't pay enough attention to that, right? Especially with the stories that we want to claim about Emma and Joseph and what was happening in their relationship, which I will say is completely in direct opposition to all of the evidence that we actually have. And so I think that to believe that Joseph was a polygamist, you have to disregard everything we know from Joseph and Emma themselves and believe all of these crazy, insane stories that were told by Brigham Young once they were in Utah about Emma being basically a crazy person. Emma trying to murder Joseph, literally poisoning him and trying to have him be killed by the mob. Emma pushing Eliza down the stairs. Emma, all of these just crazy stories that do not fit in at all with anything we know of Emma. Any reports about her, anyone that knew her, her character that is revealed throughout her life. It tells a very different story. Also, their letters, right? And their Joseph Smith III's testimony of what life was like in their home. And then also, so there's a lot more that could be said on that, but also Joseph called, ordained, sustained Emma as the Relief Society president, the highest calling for any woman, and actually quite unique to Mormonism. Most other religions didn't give women roles like that, as I understand it. It was quite a big deal. You show me any polygamous leader in any group, Mormon polygamy or any other group, who does that, who takes a woman, especially their first wife, who is disapproving of all of their other wives and is fighting against polygamy, fighting against what they're doing, and not only honors them, but puts them on a pedestal, elevates them, elevates their voice, magnifies their voice, right? I think that it's really useful to compare the way that Brigham Young looked at and treated his first wife and wives in general, women in general, compared to how Joseph Smith looked at, treated, and honored his wife. This is one that does get me a little emotional now that I've studied it. Now I have some real connections with Emma. She really got me through some hard times in my life, so I have a deep love and respect for her, and I think we do her a great disservice when we make these claims because we're making them about her as well. It just doesn't fit. And so I want to just compare Joseph's words about Emma to Brigham's words about Emma, right? The things that Joseph said about Emma were so elevating, loving, wonderful. The only negative things we have that we claim that Joseph ever said to or about Emma come from Brigham Young decades later, right? So anyway, I'll let that go right now, but there's a lot more to it. So, I guess I was just going to say, compare Brigham Young's treatment of his wives and especially treatment of women who didn't support his polygamy to how Joseph treated Emma. That is not a polygamist man. I can't make sense of that. And then number 3, all of Joseph's words, his entire body of what he produced, right? All of the scriptures that he either revealed or received through, translated or created, composed, whatever your perspective is, all of the revelations that he either received or made up, whichever your perspective is, are solidly opposed to polygamy, profoundly opposed to polygamy. He was a horrible polygamous leader, right? You compare Brigham's revelations, Brigham's sermons, and Heber's, and all of these other polygamous leaders that you can look at in all other camps and cultures, and their language does not fight against what they are actively doing. And it's so silly to claim, well, he had to keep it secret. Okay, then keep it secret. But still, the revelations would be hinting that it was okay, right? They would be not going in direct opposition to it. The Bible already does not command polygamy. 132 is factually incorrect on that. But the Book of Mormon is the strongest anti-polygamy book of scripture we have. And the Doctrine and Covenants is also massively anti-polygamy and pro-monogamy. I'll just read one of many verses. I've done episodes on each of these topics, but Doctrine and Covenants 42:22. Thou shalt love thy wife with all thy heart and shalt cleave unto her and none else. It just goes on and on. So also remember that Joseph Smith retranslated the Bible, right? He had plenty of opportunity to give Adam a bunch of wives, to give Noah a bunch of wives, to actually give Moses more than one wife. So it's clear that he's a polygamist, but I think it's clear that he's not if you study it deeply. To have God command polygamy somewhere so it at least matches with 132. He retranslated the Bible up until his death and didn't add anything about polygamy. And then we have to add to that all of his sermons, his letters, his articles, his actions. Like, I understand that we have this picture of Joseph as this hypocritical liar who's, doing all of these things, but that is circular reasoning. We think he did that because we claim he did that, right? Like, it's worth considering if these are the actions of a polygamist, and I would argue very strongly that they are not. And then we also know that the same is true of Hiram, right? It gets really interesting. Number 4, and this one we are going to take some time to get into because it's very important, and I think that a demonstration will help you understand what I'm talking about. It is the large and growing body of evidence of conspiracy, the effort to paint Joseph as a polygamist. As I said, this happened from the very beginning. One example, Mormon discussions brought up the Johnson farm tarring and feathering, and how the Johnson boys that were responsible for that claimed that there had been sexual impropriety. And I just find that ridiculous to just assume that's evidence, right? That's like so polygamy lenses, because to me, when you are going to beat someone and tar and feather them, you're going to come up with every excuse you possibly can against them. And I find myself wondering, Sidney Rigdon was also beat and tarred and feathered. He was unconscious. And what was he also guilty of sexual propriety? Like, he deserved it as well? Is that the point we're trying to make? I think they also strangely use Section 101 as evidence against Joseph. Like, they say there was something in the air. Like, these rumors all are therefore justified. And I also think that's insane. We know that at this time there were many, isn't it Lawrence Foster that wrote the book, Religion and Sexuality? I can't remember what it's called, but we know the Cochranites, the Oneida community, the Shakers went the opposite direction. There were lots of groups playing with marriage and sex and relationships. It was kind of like, I've heard it described as similar to the 60s, the hippies, right? So that would be a very apt, easy, and logical accusation to make against a religious leader that you hated at this time period, right? It's strange to take it as evidence. We need stronger evidence than that, I would say. So I don't think that those claims hold up. But I want to look specifically, since both sides tend to use them, at the Brighamite. I guess I was going to call them fraud, but the conspiracy from the Brighamites. That's the one I'm more interested in. We'll talk about the John Bennett and the others in a little while when we get into it. So let's go into a couple of these things. This first one is a little pamphlet called The Peacemaker. And most people who argue that Joseph absolutely was a polygamist just completely ignore this and throw it off and say it doesn't matter at all. It actually matters a lot. Let's look at it. It was printed, as it says very prominently on the front cover, in Nauvoo, Illinois, by J. Smith Printer, 1842, right? I will say I didn't know this. I didn't realize this until after I had done some investigation and learned some things about it. I haven't found any other pamphlet or book that has the printer published that prominently on the front cover. That seems unique to me. Right? Maybe a little suspicious. A couple of things I want to point out about this. First of all, it's awful, terrible. When I read it when I still was kind of with my, I guess when I was kind of going back and forth is when I read that one. And it was one that put the polygamy lenses back on me solidly, because I was like, how can people claim that Joseph wasn't a polygamist when he printed this? But then I read it and it was awful. It's so bad. Like, I just kept thinking, okay, Joseph was a polygamist and he was, a bad guy in all of these ways, but he wasn't stupid. Like, he wasn't this stupid. So it didn't make a lot of sense to me. But I actually imagined my surprise when I found out that December 1st, 1842, this is what a notice that Joseph printed in the Times and Seasons. There has been a book printed at my office a short time since, written by Udney H. Jacobs on marriage, without my knowledge. And had I been apprised of it, I should not have printed it. Not that I am opposed to any man enjoying his privileges, but I do not wish to have my name associated with the authors of in such an unmeaning rigmarole of nonsense, folly, and trash. Joseph Smith. So that pamphlet is actually important. It is one of the things, I think maybe one of the main things, that the Lafferty brothers found that took them down the direction that they went, which wasn't good. So I think that it's important to recognize you can't just throw this off and say, oh, that's not good evidence. No, it's not good evidence of Joseph's polygamy. It is good evidence of the the conspiracy to paint Joseph as a polygamist. One other thing I'll say really quickly about this, it was printed at the time, it was printed in 1842. So that was after the sudden, rather violent sickness, deaths of Don Carlos, Joseph's youngest brother, and, I'm forgetting his name, Robert B. Thompson, who were the printers of the Times and Seasons. They were the ones who did print that till their very sudden, untimely deaths, a short time after which John Taylor moved in and assumed responsibility for the Times and Seasons, and it was under John Taylor that this was printed. So I think that that's something interesting to consider. We shouldn't throw it off quite as lightly as we do. So anyway, there's something else. I will say this. This has happened so many times that I've seen something and it's made me go, oh my gosh, and then I dig in a little deeper and go, oh my gosh, right? So I've kind of come to expect this pattern because it happens so frequently. So we are going to talk about something that Brian Hales talks about in his journal. And I don't want to be mean, but when Brian Hales talked about this, my husband, I had him watch the video with me. My husband, who's still on the fence, he has some really hard questions after the Mormon Discussions podcast. I really dug in, and hopefully he'll like what I put out here. But anyway, as he was listening, he just kept looking at me going, what is he saying? What is he talking about? Does this make sense to you? Like, I don't think it's good. I just think you have to do better, Brian. You have to do better. Help us with this one. So this is the October 5th journal entry, October 5th, 1843. And this has become a big one once this was revealed, right? You can look at the original. I've spoken about it before. Many people have. And again, there are problems with the journals that we will talk about, but this kind of shows the process that these documents underwent. That is what those of us in my camp, I can't speak for myself, not everyone agrees, but from my experience, these things matter to us. So the original says, gave instruction to try those who were teaching on the doctrine of plurality of wives, on this law. Joseph forbids it, and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. Pretty clear, right? Now, when I have always read that in the past, when it says on this law, my natural assumption was Joseph forbids it. Joseph's like, I'm laying down the law. Here's the law. Joseph forbids it. If we want to say there's some other law, well, we could say on the law of God, right? Or we could say the law of the land. There are lots of different laws that are very clearly elucidated that Joseph has a lot of respect for if you honestly read his words. And so I just wanted to say that's pretty clear right there. It was changed, and you can see the draft copy where it was prepared for publication in the history of the church. This is also the thing that Joseph Fielding Smith quotes when the cousins are arguing, when he's like, I know Joseph promoted polygamy, and this is the one thing he can find to pull out. It's changed to, evening at home and walked up and down the streets with my scribe, gave instructions to try those persons who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives on this law. For according to the law, I hold the keys of this. According to the law, I hold the keys of this power in the last days. For there is never but one on earth at a time on whom the power and its keys are conferred. And I have constantly said, no man shall have but one wife at a time unless the Lord directs otherwise. That's astounding, right? Amazing. I'm sorry, Brian. I disagree with your claim that it was just improved, that it was a prudential change to fill in the law that Joseph was talking about. It doesn't work, especially as we see the pattern continue in other documents that we're going to look at. So the next one I want to look at is the April 8th, 1844 sermon that Hiram gave before a council of elders. He explains this is his reason for calling the council of elders together, is to put a stop to this. Put a stop to the rumors going around saying Joseph said you can have more than one wife. There was clearly something going around with Joseph's name attached to it. They were saying it was Joseph, right? And he, like this speech is so important for so many reasons. One, it helps us understand what was happening. I think that all of these things help us understand. Even I want to point out one thing, like Joseph says, the plurality, the doctrine of the plurality of wives. Joseph forbids it, right? So, Brian, another thing that you talk about is that Joseph always opposed publicly polygamy and spiritual wifery, but he never opposed celestial plural marriage. Well, you have to show me a single quote where Joseph said the words celestial plural marriage. Right? It doesn't work. It's got to be better than that. Show me one quote where he differentiates between the two, because everything I see, he does everything he can to lump it all together, to say everything except God's law of one man, one wife is wrong and forbidden, and we do not approve it. So anyway, let's go into the speech of Hiram's. This is one of the clearest, most profound denunciations of polygamy. It leaves no wiggle room to pretend that it's carefully worded denials. You can't even try that with this. And I think it's interesting. In Brian's episode, he says that he's absolutely certain that Joseph is not a bald-faced liar. He's a little more concerned about some of the things Hiram said, which I think is astonishing that he's willing to call Hiram basically a bald-faced liar, and I think that this sermon is one of the things he's talking about, although there's a lot more. So this is interesting. This was originally recorded by Thomas Bullock, and we're going to go in and talk about it a little bit more. Unfortunately, I can't show you the transcript. I'll explain that in a minute. I would love to. So let me just read some parts of this. I am authorized to tell you from henceforth that any man who comes in and tells any such damn fool doctrine, to tell him and to give up his license. None but a fool teaches such stuff. The devil himself is not such a fool. And every elder who teaches such stuff, note, the elders are teaching such stuff, ought to have his nose wrung. Anyone found guilty of such teaching will be published, and his license will be taken from him. I wish the elders of Israel to understand it is lawful for a man to marry a wife, but it is unlawful to have more. Maybe he didn't put the but in the right place. Maybe it would have been more clear if he had said it is lawful for a man to have but a wife. Sorry, I'm going back to that. Okay, we'll keep going. And God has not commanded any of you to have more. And if any of you dare to presume to do any such thing, it will spoil your fun, for you will never have the spirit to preach the gospel. I despise a man who teaches a pack of stuff that will disgrace himself so. For a man to go into the world and talk of this spiritual wife system, he is as empty as an open sepulcher. I would call the devil my brother before such a man. He has a lot more to say. He really goes into it. So I want to paint the timeline of this, right? This was April of 1844, just a month or two before Joseph and Hiram's death, right? It's 8 months after he read the revelation before the High Council, which I agree with you. Hiram read a revelation in front of the High Council. This talk helps us understand what that revelation was. I think it becomes very clear that there was a revelation received on eternal marriage. Hiram acknowledges that in this talk. And I think it's important for everyone to go read this talk. He acknowledges that and talks about it and says it's not a doctrine to be spread abroad. It's just like something to be kept sacred, kind of how we talk about the temple, right? And then he goes on to, anyway, I've always thought it was fascinating that Doctrine and Covenants, verse 1 is this huge polygamy thing, and then it goes on and talks about eternal marriage in many, many verses. only monogamously, very clear monogamous language. I've done an episode on that, how it couldn't work in any other way, right? And then there's a bunch more polygamy stuff thrown in it. So it does seem to me that there could very well be some amalgamation here. A revelation that Joseph received, that Hiram read before the city council, and then whatever this was that was being spread around in Joseph's name that people like the laws would have seen, people that, like, right? Like that's what makes the most sense to me that I think was happening. And I think we can talk about and see what is the most likely. You can disagree, but we should at least engage fairly with the ideas. So anyway, Hiram does go on to talk about the doctrine of eternal sealing. I guess my question that I wanted to ask was, is it plausible, really, that Hiram would stand up in front of the entire high council with this super secret doctrine that they weren't going to talk about, that everyone was already wanting to kill them for, that there were already all of these rumors going around? He would stand up in front of them and read it aloud to them, especially with all those parts about Emma thrown in for good measure. Why, right? And then 8 months later, he would stand up in front of those same men and say this and denounce it in this way, right? And the men in the crowd yell, "Amen, amen." Like, I think the only way to believe that is to believe to come to it with the circular reasoning of believing that they were just liars because we know they were liars. So this is what they did. Look at it a little more honestly and see what seems to make the most sense. That's my suggestion. I know that we have Leonard Sobey and some different things. I will get into all of those either in this episode or in another one. I'm going to cover as much as I can. This is just already going very long. So Hiram does go on to talk about this eternal sealing, and says it is a doctrine that is supposed to be kept sacred in Nauvoo. And he says almost every principle, well, he accuses the elders he accuses the teachers of polygamy of turning the truth of God into a lie, and says almost every principle that is communicated to us is made to have an ill effect through the foolishness of some who seek to build up themselves to destroy the truth of which they are ignorant. Oh, ye foolish elders, right? That is what he's saying to these people. And I think it gets me because we accuse these men of being liars. And when you get in and see it in this different way, your heart kind of breaks for them. Like, when you reread Joseph's May 26th sermon, when he is just bleeding with all of his heart, he's so done with these accusations. When you read it through monogamy lenses, it is heartbreaking. Your heart really breaks for these people with all of these accusations continually, and it makes it that much worse that they continue not only after their death, but 150 years after their death, So anyway, okay, so we'll go on to this a little bit because I explained how I think that this all makes sense. Hiram goes on to say, no spiritual wife doctrine ever originated with me. If there is any man that has no more sense and will make a base story of such a fact, his name shall be published. I think the reason he's saying this, well, he makes it quite clear. Hiram had a unique situation. He was a widower, right? In this sermon, he talks about being sealed to his dead wife. And the language is a little bit ambiguous. He talks about Jerusha, the mother of his 5 children, and then talks about being concerned and saying, Joseph, what can I do? And Joseph says you could be sealed to her in the same way that you can be done with baptism for the dead. You can do a sealing for the dead. And Mary can stand proxy. And it's a little ambiguous about if somehow in that process Mary would also have an eternal sealing. It's not very clear, but once it goes through the hands of the editors, it tells a very different story. So this is after it was prepared by Brigham Young's team for publication. All of a sudden, it has Hiram saying, I named the subject to my present wife, and she said, I will act as proxy for your wife that is dead, and I will be sealed to you for eternity myself, for I never had any other husband. I love you, and I do not want to be separated from you, nor be forever alone in the world to come. So it adds that section to paint Hiram as an eternal polygamist, when you could read it that way, but it's very unclear. They added that to it, right? But then they go beyond that and decide, nope, even with that addition, still is too strong. So they just cut the whole thing out and don't include it in the church history. So it would have just disappeared from church history and never have happened in what they, are presenting to us as a comprehensive church history. So that's important to see the steps that things took as they were created. A couple of other things to talk about. There's a little bit of an ongoing story here. The first person I know that found this was Whitney Horning in her research, and she wrote it in her book. She's talked about it several times since then. It's been on other podcasts. I've talked about it. So it's going around quite a bit. I saved my link and I went to get it for this episode, and the link was broken and no forwarding address. And I have tried to reach out to people in the know. These are some interesting points. There's a new address that I found quite easily that includes all of these notes by Thomas Bullock and purports to be the complete, his complete notes of this conference, but it doesn't include this sermon. So it has disappeared yet again. It seems like we're still having this happen. It's so sad when I'm hoping that it was just a mistake. I'm being accused of being like conspiratorial. It's a little weird because this kind of stuff happens a lot. And so that sermon's gone. Interestingly, William Clayton also kept a record of this conference and took notes. He didn't record Hiram's speech, and his notes are available. Also, the notes of the edits and alteration is still available that was cut out, but the original speech without any of the edits, you can't get anymore. And I think that's an interesting thing to note. So, okay, we're going to go on to another example. This was a letter written to the Relief Society by Joseph Smith and read by Emma to the Relief Society. It's another of the strong denunciations of polygamy. I just think it must have killed Brigham and Heber and any of the others to have to affix their names to this. And so if you haven't watched my last episode I did with Jeremy Hoop, I really hope you will. I've probably mentioned that before, sorry. But this is some of what it says. We do not want anyone to believe anything as coming from us contrary to the old established morals and virtues and scriptural laws regulating the habits, customs, and conduct of society. And all persons pretending to be authorized by us or having any permit or sanction from us are and will be liars and base impostors. Can you hear the lengths they're going to put down what the elders are doing, right? It could not be more clear. And then it goes through the transcription process. And here's what it says after that. Well, at least when it's recorded by Willard Richards this time. We don't want, I believe it's Willard Richards if I got it wrong. It's one of them. I think it's him. We don't want anybody to believe anything is coming from us contrary to the old established morals and virtues and scriptural laws regarding the habits, customs, and conduct of society, unless it be by message delivered to you by our own mouth, by actual revelation and commandment. And all persons pretending to be authorized by us or having any permit or sanction from us are and will be liars and base imposters. Do you see the pattern? Putting these little additions in, like they did to Joseph Smith's journal, like they did to Hiram's speech, like they did to Joseph's letter written to the Relief Society, right? It's quite astounding what starts to emerge more and more as you dig into this. The pattern should be very clear. And so there's a little bit more I just want to go into. I know that this is a long segment, but I think it matters. I think it's important. Those who have studied and know the troubles between Brigham and Emma after Emma's death. I have an episode that I want to do on that. I haven't been able to get to it yet, but there were a lot of troubles, right? And one of the things we know is the dispute over Joseph's papers, right? As the widow, Emma should have had her husband's papers. The wife keeps the papers, right? But Brigham Young took all of the papers, the histories, the records, even their personal family things, and he was desperate to get the translation of the Bible that Joseph was working on. I think he worked intensely on it up through 33, so well into the polygamy years, and then still was making edits to it until the time of his death, and Emma wouldn't give it to him. I was astounded when I learned that there were attempts to burn Emma's house down. From what I have read, she was given a threatening letter telling her she had so many days to leave her house or it would be burned down. They were trying so hard to get the transcript. She felt, or the Bible translation. She felt strongly that her best protection was to stay in her home and that God would protect her as long as she had the Bible in her home Joseph's translation of the Bible. And so that's what she did. But then she saw evidence of them trying to burn her house down, and what felt to her like divine protection. She saw where the fire had been started and had burned up the side of the house, but had gone out. And because her children were in the home, and when they were told they were going to be burned out, that's what she felt she had to do. That really confused me, because I was like, why would they burn the house down with the Bible in it? They wanted it so bad with Joseph's translation of the Bible, until it dawned on me. Oh, just like all of the other records, they either needed to alter them or destroy them, right? How useful would it be to have a Joseph translation of the Bible that gave Adam a bunch of extra wives, that gave Noah a bunch of extra wives, that God commanded, like I've already talked about, that aligned with 132. That would be really useful, right? So if they couldn't get it, which was their desire, I think, so that they could change it, the next best thing was to destroy it. So then they could later on claim what it said, which is the pattern that they seem to follow. So, they could magically maybe pull it out of a desk drawer that it had been locked in for 8 years or something along those lines. So that's an interesting one. So anyway, that's point number 4. Now we're going to go on to point number 5, which is the serious dearth of any actual evidence of Joseph's polygamy that isn't subject to these previous problems: the framing, fraud, and forgery. Right? We have a couple of clear actors that are central in this. And I know it's disputed, but William Clayton, Willard Richards, they're highly problematic. I'm trying to think if I'm not thinking of anything, but off the top of my head, everything I can think of that ties Joseph to polygamy, what comes through those sources. Kingsbury is very as well. And I will say, I have episodes planned on them. Jeremy Hoop already came out and did Brigham and Heber. I think our next one is going to be Clayton and Kingsbury, if I'm remembering right. So it's coming. We're going to get into it more and do the deep dive. It's important information to understand if you want to understand it. I think that as we get more and more access, right, as information becomes more and more available, we should assume we get closer and closer to the truth, right? The thing that is happening is that the evidence of Joseph's polygamy is decreasing and the evidence of the conspiracy is increasing. The exact opposite should be the case. As we have the ability to DNA test, we should find children and not find that all of the claimed children were actually not true. We should find more, we're getting more and more information, and this is the trajectory we're going on. That is the picture that is emerging very clearly. I think that matters. Also, I think it's interesting to pay attention to all of the things we don't have, all of the journals that are missing, all of the records that are missing that should be there somewhere, and we don't have them. I think it's interesting that they were all turned into Brigham Young, and we know that from his own words that they went through this process of being arranged to fit the new order of things. So that's interesting to consider, and I think rather important. Point number 6 is the known character of what I will call the polygamy conspirators versus what I can find of the character of Joseph and Hiram Smith and Emma Smith from their own words, scriptures, letters, actions, etc. Like just going on, it paints a very different picture. And I'm talking about the Joseph Smith that emerges from his own words, not from the version that was painted of him by the conspirators, right? That's an important distinction. So I want to give a couple of examples. Let's just talk about how Joseph and Hiram viewed marriage, right? If you study about their family, 2 of their sisters were in very difficult marriages, married to men who were just not good guys. And a polygamist would marry his sister to a better guy, a guy with bigger keys, right? Would improve her situation by marrying her to someone who mattered more. That is not what these brothers did. They just worked with those men and tried to help and save and improve those marriages. They seemed to really honor the sanctity and union of marriage. And then another thing, this is a letter that I have to thank those really quickly who have sent me things. I've been working on this. I haven't had time. You probably can tell how sleep deprived I am. I'm trying to stay awake to finish. So I have enlisted my friends to say, can you please send me this? Can you please send me this? Because I just didn't have time to find all the resources. So I want to thank all of you who helped me. You know who you are, and I appreciate it so much. So this was sent to me by a friend, Whitney. Thank you. And It's the letter that Joseph and Hiram wrote to Parley Pratt to give to all of the saints in Europe and abroad. And it is basically, well, it's actually really important for a number of reasons. I will put the link in the descriptions. I think everyone should read it because it has a lot of important things to share. I'm just going to read little snippets of it. Whereas in times past, persons have been permitted to gather with the saints at Nauvoo in North America, such as husbands leaving their wives and children behind, describes situations. Wives leaving their children, husbands leaving, it goes into that a bit. Talks about a spouse leaving their other spouse because they are an unbeliever. Then it says, all this kind of proceedings we consider to be an error, and for the want of proper information, and the same should be taught to all the saints, and not suffer families to be broken up on no account whatever, if it is possible to avoid it. Suffer no man to leave his wife because she is an unbeliever, nor no woman to leave her husband because he is an unbeliever. These things are an evil and must be forbidden by the authorities of the church, or they will come under condemnation. He then goes on and accurately quotes and applies scriptures, as Joseph did accurately apply scripture, unlike his predecessor, and that not his predecessor, the one that came after. He then warns that spouses that are separate will open themselves to temptation. And goes on to say, and there are several instances where women have left their husbands and come to this place, and in a few weeks or months they have found themselves new husbands, and they are living in adultery, and we are obligated to cut them off from the church. There are men who are also guilty of the same crime, as we are credibly informed. We are knowing to their having taken wives here, and are incredibly informed that they have wives in England. Every man, and they absolutely forbid that. So that speaks directly to polygamy, right? Every man should tarry with his family until providence provides for the whole. We forbid a man's leaving his family behind because he has no means to bring them. If the church is not able to bring them and the parish will not send, let the man tarry with his family, live with them and die with them, and not leave them until providence open a way for them to all come together. And we also forbid that a woman shall leave her husband because he is an unbeliever. We also forbid that a man shall leave his wife because she is an unbeliever. If he is a bad man, there is a law to remedy that. Oh, this is why I included that. If he is a bad man, there is a law to remedy that evil. And if she is a bad woman, there is a law to remedy that evil. And if the law will divorce them, then they are at liberty. Otherwise, they are bound as long as they two shall live. Is that amazing? Have you heard that before, right? Kind of important to understand what they were teaching. To me, I can't help but compare this for those who have watched my episode on the emergence of 132, or just go read the Deseret News report of that entire conference. And they spend the whole first half of the conference sending men on missions and telling them, when you go on a mission, forget that you have a wife at home. Don't look back. Don't think about your wife and children. If they suffer and die, and if they starve to death, so be it. They're in God's hands. And all of these men would go off and come back from their missions with a new wife, with a new non-English speaking Scandinavian wife, pregnant or with a baby on her lap, home to the wife who has been, trying desperately to keep her family alive in Frontier, Utah. That's a pretty big difference in the character of how these people viewed marriage, and then also how they viewed women. We're going to go into it a little bit more when we answer some of the points, but if you look at how Joseph and Hiram viewed women, read Hiram's letters to Mary when he's in prison, Joseph's letters with Emma. Joseph relied on Emma so much with his business dealings, with his decisions. She was a true counselor to him, and not the case with Brigham Young. So it's hard to choose which quotes to share. There are so many, but I just grabbed a few. I tried to do ones that I haven't read before. I know I've read this one once in one of my many episodes, but I just think it's important to get a sense for the difference between these people. So this is a polygamist, if you want to understand, right? This is Brigham Young, September 21st, 1856. It's Journal of Discourses, Volume 4, pages 51 through 57. Now my proposition. A lot of you will be familiar with this one. It is more particular for my sisters, as it is frequently happening that women will say they are unhappy. Men will say, my wife, though a most excellent woman, has not seen a happy day since I took my second wife. No, not a happy day for a year, says one. And another has not seen a happy day for 5 years. It is said that women are tied down and abused, that they are misused and have not had the liberty they ought to have had, that many of them are wading through a perfect flood of tears because of the conduct of some men, together with their own folly. I wish my own women to understand that what I am going to say is for them as well as others, and I want those who are here to tell their sisters, yes, all the women of this community, and then write it back to the States and do as you please with it. I am going to give you from this time to the 6th day of October next for reflection, that you may determine whether you wish to stay with your husbands or not. And then I am going to set every woman at liberty and say to them, now go your way, my women with the rest, go your way. Now, some people honestly interpret this to see, look how liberal Brigham Young was. He would just let anyone have a divorce. Remember that this is under the threat of so many things. These women had no means of protection or being provided for. We always use that as an excuse for polygamy, right? To provide for the women. No, that's prostitution. But anyway, the other thing is these women had been taught that their entire salvation and exaltation was based on their marriage, these polygamous marriages, right? So you're giving them the freedom to damn themselves is what you're doing. It's kind of like when the polygamists now threaten the young men, straighten up or you're free to leave, right? And they become a lost boy. That's a great option, isn't it? Do not misread this to think he's being generous here. And my wives have got to do one of two things, either round up their shoulders to endure the afflictions of this world and live their religion, or they may leave, for I will not have them about me. I will go into heaven alone rather than have scratching and fighting around me. I will set all at liberty. What, first wife too? Yes, I will liberate you all. I know what my women will say. They will say, you can have as many women as you please, Brigham, but I want to go somewhere and do something. Oh, and he's saying, but I want to go somewhere and do something to get rid of the whiners. So they're saying, it's not fair, Brigham. You can have all the wives you want. And he's like, I'm getting rid of the whiners. I do not want them to receive a part of the truth and spurn the rest out of doors. I wish my women and Brother Kimball's and Brother Grant's to leave, and every woman in this territory, or else say in their hearts that they will embrace the gospel, the whole of it. Tell the Gentiles that I will free every woman in this territory. Notice language. I will free every woman in this territory at our next conference. What, the first wife too? Yes, there shall not be one held in bondage. All shall be set free. And then let the father be the head, and then let the father be the head of the family, the master of his household, and let him treat them as an angel would treat them. And let the wives and the children say amen to what he says, and be subject to his dictates, instead of their dictating the man, instead of their trying to govern him. See, this was before Keep Sweet had been really embedded. These women weren't yet perfectly trained in the subtle art of keeping sweet. He had to get them there, right? And then he makes a false promise that he would provide for them. People like to point this out too. We have enough examples to see how Brigham Young was with money, how he treated people he wasn't happy with or didn't agree with. We even have wives who divorced him and tried to get a settlement. We see how amenable he was to that, right? So no, Brigham often makes a point of stating his generosity when he never actually has to live up to it. So now recollect that 2 weeks from tomorrow, I'm going to set you at liberty. But the first wife will say, it is hard, for I have lived with my husband 20 years or 30 and have raised a family of children for him. And it is a great trial. Sorry, this is hitting me. It is a great trial to me for him to have more women. That's the woman that's the older woman, right? That first wife that's older as the husband is marrying teenagers. Then I say, this is his response to those heartbroken first wives, the older women. Then I say, it is time that you gave him up to the other woman who will bear children. If my wife had borne me all the children that she ever would bear, the celestial law would teach me to take the young women that would have children. Do you understand this? I have told you many times that there are multitudes of pure and holy spirits waiting to take tabernacles. Now, what is our duty? To prepare tabernacles for them, to take a course that will not tend to drive those spirits into the families of the wicked, where they will be trained in wickedness, debauchery, and every species of crime. It is the duty of every righteous man and woman to prepare tabernacles for all the spirits they can. Hence, if my women leave, I will go and search up others who will abide the celestial law, and let all I now have go where they please, though I will send the gospel to them. That's a threat, just so you know. This is the reason reason why the doctrine of plurality of wives was revealed, that the noble spirits which are waiting for tabernacles may be brought forth. I know that was a lot to read, but it's also important to understand a little bit more about this doctrine that we're going to go into a little bit more. Oh, there's just a little bit more I have. Sisters, I am not joking. I do not throw out my proposition to banter your feelings, to see whether you will leave your husbands, all or any of you. But I do know this, that there is no cessation to the everlasting whining of many of the women of this territory. I am satisfied that this is the case, and if the women will turn from the commandments of God and continue to despise the order of heaven, I will pray that the curse of the Almighty may be close to their heels, and that it may be following them all the day long. And those that enter into it and are faithful, I will promise them that they shall be queens in heaven and rulers to all and eternities. He continues on and on and on, but we'll leave it there. So you get a sense, right? And we can say all we want. Joseph had to keep it secret. I want to make it clear. There is a polygamist way of being a man, right? And I know that offends some people. I know there are good men who are suffering under polygamy as well. But the mindset of the polygamous man is something unique. Like when I've had people tell me that even the cosmos, testifies of polygamy because we have one sun and 9 planets that orbit it. Because of course, the sun is the man and the planets are the women. I mean, it's just insane, the things their way that their brains work, right? And so you have to compare it. Does Joseph have that polygamist mindset? I would argue very staunchly that he does not. I'll do another one. This is just because I think it matters. This is Heber C. Kimball, November 9th, 1856. Talk on partaking of the sacrament worthily. So that's what he's talking about, is those who worthily partake the sacrament. I do not consider that one of my wives or one of my children has the right to partake of these emblems until they make a full and proper restitution to me if they have offended me. Why is this? So you're not worthy to take the sacrament if you've offended me unless you have made a full restitution and I'm no longer upset with you. Because I am their head, I am their governor, their dictator, their revelator, their prophet, and their priest. And if they rebel against me, they at once raise a mutiny in my family. I forbid all unworthy persons partaking of this sacrament. And if such do partake of it, they shall do it to their own responsibility and not on mine. In partaking unworthily, a person is corroding and destroying himself, not me. Do you think a wife is contending against her husband with a good spirit when she is commanded to be subject to her husband, even as we are to Christ? I want to know what good a wife is to me unless she will let me lead and guide and let me govern her by the word of God. Then he says, when a wife is obedient to her husband, there is union, there is heaven. There are many kinds of sin, among which is the sin of confusion. And I will tell you, there is plenty of confusion in a family where each wants to be head. And then I do not want to see a man or woman partake of this sacrament when they are living in open rebellion against God, against his government, and against his servants. I have no wife nor child that has any right to rebel against me. If they violate my laws and rebel against me, they will get into trouble just as quickly as though they had transgressed the counsels and teachings of Brother Brigham. Does it give a woman a right to sin against me because she is my wife? No, it is her duty to do my will, as I do the will of my Father and my God. It is the duty of a woman to be obedient to her husband. I want to clarify that when he says my Father and my God, I'm not at all certain if he's talking about God or if he's talking about Brigham, based on many other sermons that they've given and their perspective. Just wanted to clarify that. It is the duty of a woman to be obedient to her husband. Unless she is, I would not give a damn for all her queenly right and authority, nor for her either, if she will quarrel and lie about the work of God and the principle of plurality. I tell you, as the Lord God Almighty lives, my sword is unsheathed, and I will never sheath it until those of you who have done wrong repent of your evil deeds. Some of you have found fault because I am so plain and severe. No man can rise up here with his sophistry and silver on his lips and have the Holy Spirit for a moment. So anyway, the reason I wanted to read those is so you can sense the difference. Show me a single sermon of Joseph Smith that was anything like these, right? Polygamist men preach their doctrine. They preach it ad nauseum, on and on and on. They assert their authority. It doesn't make sense that Joseph would have brought forth the revelations and the scriptures that he did, would treat Emma the way he did. We'll go into that a little bit more if he was a polygamist. It just doesn't hold. And the seventh and final point that I'll just briefly mention is the complete inanity of the doctrine. Just the fact that None of it makes sense. There's no consistency to any of it. There's no through line. The polygamists in Utah, they were very clear on their reasons for polygamy, right? But it had nothing to do with anything Joseph ever said or ever taught, or the things that we ever claimed that he did. They couldn't stretch it far enough to make it fit him. It has nothing to do with Section 132. It has nothing to do with any of Joseph Smith's scriptures, and it has nothing to do with even what we explain are the reasons for it today. There was nothing but excuses and justifications by the following leaders. And I think that Joseph, as the originator of the doctrine, the originator of the scriptures, could have made it make a lot more sense. If he had been the author of it, it would have been better. I don't mean things would be better. I mean, it would have been done better. It would make more sense. It would have a through line and have some stability and something that made sense. So anyway, those are the quick things I wanted to go into. And so now I want to get into the videos, finally, right now that we're an hour in. And so the first thing I want to address is the accusation of motivated reasoning, right? Of we just desperately need Joseph to be innocent. Again, I hope that people will reconsider that, because it is very offensive. It's like telling people who have left the church that they just wanted to sin, right? It is invalidating them and their reasons. Sure, maybe there are people who just wanted to sin and left the church, and maybe there are people who just need Joseph to be innocent and so don't do any of the work. That's not me. That's not most of us that are into this. So I wish that we could have a better dialogue than that. Just very quickly, for those who know my story, they know, like, it took me a long time to change my mind. I actually was at pretty much complete peace with Joseph being a polygamist. As I said, I have publicly changed my mind many, many times. And for a long time, once I knew that polygamy was not of God, I just thought, okay, that's why Joseph lost his spiritual protection and was allowed to be killed. And that worked for me just fine. I was perfectly comfortable with my polygamy lenses on, right? It was the evidence that changed my mind. It was very much the evidence that changed my mind. And I will say, actually, I was fine changing my mind. It was stunning, astonishing. It's like when you discover the camels instead of the shadows. You're like, whoa, everything just completely shifted and changed in how I see it. Other people who've had if you've had a faith transition, you know how that goes, right? This is mild compared to that, but it's a similar thing. I, however, had worked really hard to try to have some credibility, some validity, right? This podcast is really important to me for many reasons that people watch it will understand. And it was really hard for me to risk all of that, to come out and say, I don't believe it, right? I knew what could happen. And I will say it was the evidence that convinced me, but it required spiritual guidance and confirmations and encouragement to give me the courage to be willing to come out and say it. That was my process. And so I think that we need to do a lot better in how we address this. So yeah, like I did my podcast for a year before I sincerely acknowledged and found other pieces that gave me more confidence to be able to make this claim. And I've been digging more and more into it since then. But it's not fair to accuse me of motivated reasoning any more than it is fair to accuse any of you of that, right? Or just having deep motivations. And so next is the accusation of being conspiracy theorists. This one's fun and easy. The fact is, when it comes to polygamy, all of us are conspiracy theorists, whichever set of lenses you have. With the polygamy lenses, you believe that Joseph Smith and all of the others conspired to hide his polygamy, right? And with these, you believe that the later leaders and the anti-Josephites conspired to paint Joseph as a polygamist. It goes both ways. You can't have it one way or the other. So again, it's not a useful title. We just have to believe which conspiracy has better evidence to back it up. Not just more evidence to back it up, because remember, things were destroyed and changed, but better evidence to back it up. So right? So we'll go on to that. Okay, now first, I'll just really quickly go into Brian Hales' video. I've addressed it a little bit. It's shorter and less meaty than the than the other one, so it'll be easier to get into. And so this video is mainly addressed to what I've called the antagonists, the anti-Josephites, right? And so right now I'm responding to Brian's following is the apologists, the Brighamites. And so that's who I'm just going to be really quick to respond to. This post by John Hayek, who I've had on the show and who's going to be coming on again very soon, was one of the funniest Facebook posts I've ever read, maybe. So I'm going to leave it here. I recommend the group Hemlock Knots for those of you who are interested in this discussion. It's a great Facebook group where and my kids wouldn't join it because, you know, grandma's on Facebook. I'm a grandma. So, but it's a great Facebook group where there's just a lot of information you can get on and ask questions. They really like to keep the topic on point. So they have pretty strict rules of what's allowed to be posted. But I really recommend going to that group. And if you do, you can search John Hayek and find this post, and it's well worth the read. It starts by saying, the most concise polygamy debate ever. Brian Hales debated himself and lost. And I don't mean to be mean at all. I don't like that. But it just made me laugh as he goes through a rundown of the debate. A couple of things I'll mention really quickly is, well, I've already talked about, in the last episode, I mentioned how you sometimes learn that you need to see people's accusations as their confessions, right? I think that this was a pretty clear demonstration of that. You also learn that you see people's defending themselves against things as their confessions as well, right? The "Mom, I didn't eat all the cookies" example, right? And so I think that those are both at play in this video. And so just a couple of things. He says the word transparency, I think, at least 20 times, right? And while ignoring all of this evidence that I'm presenting, right? While never addressing any of the things, like, of course he's transparent about all the things that paint Joseph as a polygamist, but he completely avoids everything from the other side until it's been brought up so much that he feels like he has to address it, like the journal entry that he tried to address. So I don't think that that's terribly transparent. It's also interesting that he said that while papers are being deleted from the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which is very sad to see as potentially. I hope there's just a mistake. That's what he told me, but it doesn't look good. So I'd like to hope that we are going for transparency. So I'll really quickly just say, Brian starts out by talking about amateur historians versus trained historians. It just was delightful to watch. It was so fun because he, you know, after going on about his big diatribe about amateur historians, he very quietly and quickly admits that he also is one. But he took part of one class, but then had to drop out, but hasn't re-enrolled. Oh, he also took that part of one class after he'd already written all of his books and done all of his website and everything. But, you know, he is an amateur historian, but he really tries to act like a trained historian. So anyway, it was pretty amusing to me. He says the amateur historians choose their conclusions, then search the historical record for supportive documents. Who does that sound like? Who knows from the outset that polygamy was commanded of God, that everything Joseph did was right, and, you know, except for the things he would have done differently, and right? So I thought that was a little bit ironic. And then he said, and then they take things out of context. He explains it's called proof texting. Exactly, it is called proof texting. I have been engaging with polygamists long enough to know how expert they are at it. For example, their reading of Jacob 2:30 or of any of the rest of the scriptures. If you like it's pretty fun to engage in proof texting and people who want to claim that polygamy was of God. Or, for example, claiming that you have to say but to only say one. One only means one if you say but one, right? And so there's a lot of that going on. And then you know, he talks about how trained historians search all the evidence and then form their conclusions on all of the evidence. I will say, that's me. That's what I try very hard to do. I'm here engaging, right? Looking at all of the evidence the very best I can. And so anyway, it goes on from there. It really does, in my opinion, take circular reasoning to just a whole new level. I've already talked a little bit about it, but I do have to point out one thing because this got a little bit personal. It was pretty funny. He gives a timestamp of some video from some podcaster without saying her name. I'm guessing it's me. My husband told me I had to play this clip.
You all know exactly who I am. Say my name.
I'm actually just fine with him not saying my name. That is not a problem to me at all. I was actually scared that I was going to be mocked and excoriated. It's so easy to mock me. So I would rather not be mentioned than be publicly mocked and humiliated. But it was about me quoting something from Phoebe Woodruff from the Anti-Polygamy Standard. So I want to go into the whole thing, but I won't. But I will just say this. He claims that the quote I used from the Anti-Polygamy Standard is saying that Phoebe was felt coerced to say that she loved polygamy when she didn't. He uses other sources that were official church publications that Phoebe was likely coerced to do to say, no, look, she loved polygamy. And the Anti-Polygamy Standard isn't a good source because they were fighting against polygamy. And he is correct that it just says a friend. The people at this time did not feel safe to come out, right? So it would have been better if they had a name and a date. I confess all of that. However, it is in keeping with what we know of Utah and this time and the women and the people. And they wouldn't have. And anyway, I just read that quote from Brigham Young talking about how much the women loved polygamy, right? So it's interesting to me that he chooses this one to pick on. They're like it was really funny to me. I also want to say I've done lots of episodes on women in Utah, the testimonies of women. I would recommend those videos. My episode on Jenny Anderson Froiseth, I love that video. Jenny Anderson Froiseth is the one who did the Anti-Polygamy Standard. And she is in the vein of Tanya Toole, a woman living in Utah, seeing what was happening, and gave freely of her own immense energy, time, talent, money to try to help. She was like constantly begging subscriptions, begging for donations to try to help the women in Utah. So I ask you, who's more motivated to say things that maybe were not exactly right? Like this power structure where they had to prove polygamy, or a woman just here trying to help? So anyway, I shouldn't have got onto that. It just got a little bit personal and I thought it was a little bit funny. I will defend using that source, and I believe I acknowledged the problems with it. So anyway, then he goes on and he hits Denver Snuffer and Rob Fotheringham in ways that I think are unfair. I'm really excited. Denver Snuffer, I hope, is going to come on my podcast soon because I want to give him a chance to speak for himself, because I think it's very unfair for him to be effectively silenced by becoming a pariah because of excommunication, and then to have Brian Hales keep hitting him and completely straw-manning his argument. I don't think that's fair at all. So I'm excited to have Denver Snuffer come on and be able to speak for himself instead of being spoken for. But anyway, he really, this is a funny claim. He accuses them of reductionism for saying the question is, do you believe Joseph and Emma and I'll add Hiram, or do you believe Brigham? And it's funny because he's being so reductive to reduce their entire point to that and then claim it's reductive. Again, the accusations are the confessions, right? There's just so much more to it than that. And it's such a straw man. And then I've talked about it a little bit more, but I will say he ends with this ludicrous claim that I see everywhere from the apologists, the Brighamites, right? That they say, and it's funny I'm calling people Brighamites. I just mean those, I don't mean those who were in the church, because I am in the church. I mean those who hold to the doctrines of Brigham. I don't, like, the church now doesn't even hold to the doctrines of Brigham. So those who do are the ones I'm calling Brighamites. The FLDS, the fundamentalists, and the pro-polygamy Mormons are who I'm talking about with that. And so anyway, he again claims that Joseph Smith denied spiritual wifery and polygamy, but never denied celestial plural marriage. So I went into that before. Still, show me a quote, show me where that happened. And then, just like in the other one, doesn't even address the question of children until the very end, when it happens to be asked him as a question. So I didn't find it compelling. I'm sorry, I didn't. And now we'll get on to the Mormon discussions, because that's the meatier one, and that's what I think we're really here for. So there is a lot here. It was a 2.5-hour podcast. I'm already, at an hour and a half? So I'm going to do my best to respond. I have just put my notes in order, gone through point by point by point. I think I'm going to have to do it in 2 episodes to really get into it fairly. And so I will say that because of all of what felt like to me the accusations, the attributing motives to me and other people I know, it was really frustrating to listen to, right? So you're not the only ones experiencing cognitive dissonance and some anger. I'm trying really hard not to attribute motives. I apologize if I do, but that I think is unfortunate, and I think we need to do better in our dialogue. So, and then it did feel to me like a lot of circular reasoning, a lot of weak evidence. However, there were a couple of things that really took me back that were like, oh, I need to dig into that. Like if I'm really, it's easy to just kind of ignore the things that don't fit your lenses. I tried really hard not to do that. And so that's what I want to spend the most time on. Actually, the things I really dug into are the things that I hadn't dug into yet. So I'm excited to share them. It's fun to dig in because I found things that really were cool to find. So again, the pattern held true for me. It continues to hold true that I see a lot of smoke. That was what I thought about Joseph. There's so much smoke, there has to be fire, but I just end up, when you get in close, you see a lot of smoke bombs, you see a lot of shadows instead of camels. And so that's what's happened again. So, okay. Both podcasts, I will say, straw man the question of 132 provenance. So I want to be brief on this because we're already going so long, but they both claim that the issue is that we don't have the original. That is not the issue at all. It's a complete straw man. They both claim it's one of the best documented revelations that we have, and I will adamantly disagree with that for so many reasons. But first of all, let's just say this. Joseph's revelations, almost all of them were printed during his life. They were printed in the Times and Seasons. They were included in the Book of Commandments or in the Doctrine and Covenants. They weren't hidden in a drawer to be magically pulled out 8 years after his death. They also didn't require other sections to be taken out so that they could be added because they were so contradictory to everything else that Joseph taught. They weren't filled with these kinds of problems. Also, we have no other source for it other than this little team of conspirators, of the polygamy conspirators, right? It's based completely on the credibility of the polygamy conspirators, which I think is highly problematic. And so that's those are some of the things that we can talk about, but I think that claiming that Section 132 has some of the best provenance of any of the revelations is an extremely weak claim. I am not convinced by that. And so then they talked about Clayton's diaries. I already did an episode with John Hayacek on that. I'm planning another episode upcoming on Clayton himself that we'll really talk about. So anyway, the question is, were Clayton's diaries like diaries he carried around? I think that word diaries is really confusing. I want to go in today to a little bit of Joseph Smith's diaries, and I'll talk a little more about William Clayton's diaries. But in general, when you hear diary, don't assume that it's like the little book that they wrote in every night or carried around with them to write things in. That's not what it meant, right? All of the diaries we claim we have of women are later reminiscences. If they have any, they might have been diaries of their day-to-day in Utah. There are no diaries that exist any longer of their time in Nauvoo that report anything having to do with polygamy. So diary is a tricky word. Draft book, copy book, we're maybe getting a little bit closer. So anyway, okay, then both sides also point to similarities between Section 132 and other sources like the law's testimonies or Clayton's books, Clayton's diaries, right? And so let me restate, just in case it wasn't clear, that isn't surprising to me because I believe there was a revelation about eternal marriage that wasn't published because it was meant to be held private and sacred. It was not meant to be published abroad. As Hiram said, that was read to the High Council. I also think there were things going around as they continually tried to put down that were said to be done and taught by Joseph Smith, and that he was constantly denying. So it's not at all surprising that these ideas show up, right? And so we can get in later to talk about motives of these different people, but I just want to say that's not surprising to me. That's exactly what, I think that makes the most sense of everything. When I look at it, Occam's razor tells me that's the most likely scenario. Until I see more evidence that gives me a better scenario, that's what I think it was. And so anyway, they were obviously not afraid to change change things, to change revelations, to change, Brigham talked about his historical team getting everything to fit the new order of things. So I think that that's what's happening. Things were being done behind Joseph's back during his life and without his authorization after his death. It's not very good. So anyway, I've already in another episode shared, I think my first conversation with Whitney Horning shared my thoughts about Fanny Alger. They just mentioned it briefly. So I'm just going to mention one thing here because they said it again. They bring it up. In the 1800s, affair had zero sexual connotation. The word affair had nothing to do with sex. The 1828 dictionary, this is pretty basic research. The Webster 1828 dictionary is the dictionary that defines the words that as they would have been used at that time, right? You can look up affair. It has a very long entry. I showed it on one of my episodes. Very long entry. None of the many, many possibilities of that word have any sexual connotation. So what happened was the word scrape was used and then was crossed out and affair added, not to make it more correct that it had a sexual connotation, but because scrape was too much of a slang word. And so they wanted to use a better word. At least that's one of the explanations I've heard that makes more sense to me. Affair does not mean sex in the 1800s. Can we set that out? We just need to accept that and move on. And then we can talk about it. So another thing that I want to say is that Emma was a strong woman. Emma spoke up to men. Emma voiced her opinion. Emma had already left her family and become fully estranged from her parents and most of her family she didn't ever see again because she had a mind of her own and was willing to express it. I don't think that Emma would have put up with what we claim Emma put up with. I do have my feelings about what happened with Fanny Alger, but I think it is not what is claimed. Definitely isn't evidence of polygamy. I mean, the only thing you can do is just put these lenses on so thick that nothing has to make sense. All we need to know is Joseph was a sexual predator, so nothing else matters. We're just looking for evidence of that everywhere. So anyway, I'm not going to go into that more right now, but that's that part right now. Okay, so the happiness letter is the next thing that they bring up. And I'm actually, I went ahead and watched the episode that Bill Reel suggested that he did on the happiness letter, and I'm actually chomping at the bit to do a response video to it. I think that's going to be really fun. But in the meantime, so I don't take too much time now, I highly recommend Rob Fotheringham's excellent video on Martha Brotherton and the happiness letter. And I think it's really good. And if you want to get a very compact understanding of this entire perspective, watch his first video. I think it's called something like First Polygamist, Joseph or Brigham. And while you're at it, just watch his videos. I think that they're really good. And since he's already spelled that out so well, I'm not going to take time to do it here, but here is his list of the main problems he finds with the happiness letter that he discusses. When I do my podcast on it, I'll be able to dig into some other things more specifically. So it will add to the body of knowledge because I have different things that I'm planning to address. So anyway, I think that's pretty useful. That's where I would recommend you go for an understanding of a different way to see the happiness letter that rings more true to me. And then the next source they talk about is John C. Bennett, right? And some things to know about Bennett as a source in general. And we all agree on this, right? He is a known pathological and very convincing liar. He was able to weasel his way in everywhere with everyone. He was able to, be a member of, wasn't he a member of the first presidency as well as the mayor of Nauvoo, and weasel his way into many women's beds in Nauvoo. And he was already a womanizer before he ever came here. So he is just problematic from top to bottom. The thing that's interesting is a lot of what he did had a lot in common. I mean, he had the same goals as the other side that wanted to have Joseph be a polygamist as well. So I kind of, this is funny, but I can't help wonder if there was maybe some sort of collusion. What Bennett was doing wasn't all that far off from what many of the other elders were doing behind Joseph's back. So just I wonder about my strange conspiracy brain just wonders if there happened to be conversations going on about, hey, I'll do a podcast on this topic and you do a podcast on this topic, because we have to get rid of the Joseph polygamy scenario. Oh, and here are some sources you can use. Oh, and by the way, you have to say but to me, have it mean just one. Like, there are just a lot of crazy similarities that I wonder if there are ever conversations. I don't know, maybe not. Same thing, I wonder if there ever were some kind of collaborations, I guess is a better word here. But anyway, I think that it's interesting that he does have the initials and the wedding dates. That's, I think, or the, not just some of the initials of the weddings with the person who performed the sealing. I think that is interesting. Yeah, there's, I have to think about that hard. But when I take this other complete body of evidence and compare it to this, it's kind of like this. It's like when you watch a magician on the stage, like, saw their assistant in half, right? And then she comes back out of the box and it's whole. From all of my experience, I know that women aren't sawed in half and then in boxes and put back together. So my brain starts going, I wonder how the magician did that. Not like, oh my word, he's magical and he just sawed a woman in half, right? So I do have that bias now. I confess, I have that bias now. So when I see something like these affidavits, I'm like, this seems way more likely to me, any of these scenarios. So I'll share a couple of them with you, because I would say that with this bias, proving the children is a lot harder, right? So what I actually think is the most likely case here is that John Bennett did seduce many women and was perhaps, if not colluding, at least collaborating with many of the men. He had dirt on them, right? It's like Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, right? Like, you're going to do what we want you to do because we've got dirt on you. I think that is a far more likely scenario. They claim in the Mormon discussions that he used the initials so that perhaps he wouldn't be sued. I think that's ridiculous. It wasn't the women who would sue. It was Joseph Smith who would sue, and he had no problem naming him, right? In fact, we do have cases when Joseph Smith sued over libel. And I think that that they just haven't come up with any good explanation of why he just used the initials. I think it was to like send a message, one way or the other. Like, I've got your back, you've got mine, or I'm going to out you, or whatever it would be. That seems possible to me. We have sources, including Brigham Young, that tell us that John Bennett was having an affair with Sarah Pratt, right? And so there's a lot going on there. Again, I'm not the ultimate expert on this, so if I get some, if someone wants to add something, that's great. I would like to study these things more. I've put I think I've studied more than 99% of the people who were screaming at me that Joseph was a polygamist, because I don't consider studying being reading the books that people prepared. I consider it getting into the actual sources and really examining the evidence. So anyway, that's what I think was the most likely explanation. I also think it's not hard to see that when these later reminiscences were coming out, when the storyline, the narrative was being crafted in Utah, they had full access to everything that John Bennett had published. It's not that hard to make some of the details match. So we'll anyway leave it there. I know that won't be convincing to some of you, but like I said, you've got a lot bigger problems to solve on your side. And to me, I think it is pretty, the fact of how problematic Bennett is as a source should give everybody some concern who wants to rest their hat on him as evidence. So anyway, we'll leave it there. But Martha Brotherton, even though her story comes through Bennett, I do believe her story, and it makes me so angry. I really I just want to go to battle for Martha Brotherton. I hate what happened to her. And I think it matters that we have the right perpetrators, right? That we accuse the right people. So again, it's covered in Rob's video, but I'll just explain really quickly my thinking and a couple of things. When you read through Martha Brotherton's affidavit, a couple of things become very clear. She had never met Joseph Smith. She'd never seen Joseph Smith. She didn't know who he was. There's this really weird time crunch that seems to be happening, this full court press that's almost like, hurry, hurry, decide. Maybe because they only had the free use of the store for that long until Joseph would get back from wherever maybe he was. This is what seems like the most likely scenario to me. When I hear Joseph Smith, when I hear Martha Brotherton's report of what Joseph Smith said, It does not sound like Joseph Smith. This is just a small thing, and I don't want people to make fun of it. I'm just throwing it out there because it's the easiest one to explain. But I have read through quite a bit, and I've never heard Joseph Smith call anyone sis, right? He calls her sis, and he's kind of got this attitude. It's weird. I think that Brigham and Heber had access to the store, and there was a third collaborator who was pretending to be Joseph Smith. And yes, you can say that's insane, that's crazy. I think it makes perfect sense, and it fits so well because it's really hard to make sense of this one. I know we talk about the pattern and it fits into the pattern, but again, please consider that is circular reasoning. You believe the pattern exists, so you see the pattern because you know it exists, so you think that the pattern gives these things more credibility. I strongly disagree with you, and I think you should consider that level of circular reasoning, and if there are other things that would be better explanations. Again, I'd like to dig into this more, and I recommend Rob's video, but I think it's worth considering. It doesn't convince me. I think that both Martha Brotherton and Joseph Smith were telling the truth. I think Martha Brotherton was telling the truth in her affidavit, and I think Joseph Smith was telling the truth when he was like, I didn't do this. I cannot figure out why she's saying I did this. I believe both of them because I think that there were other people causing problems. It's like, you know, when there are those people that just cause problems and everyone's kind of a victim of them because they sow all this dispute, they triangulate everyone, right? So anyway, it makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that for Martha Brotherton's sake, we need to hold the right men accountable and not blame the man who I think was innocent. So anyway, now this is one that I did dig into because it was one that threw me for a loop. So I'm super excited to share it with you now. The Melissa Lott Bible was the next issue they brought up. I hope everyone is aware that I'm going through systematically, issue by issue, not skipping anything, so that you can't accuse me of cherry picking or proof texting. I really do want to cover each of these issues. So that's what I'm trying to do. I can't elucidate all of it here, so I'm referring you to other sources on some of them. But I hadn't seen anything done on the Melissa Lott Bible, and I was like, ooh, that looks bad. So I dug into it, and I'm super excited to share what I found. So for those, hopefully you guys that are watching this have watched the Mormon discussions. I'll have it in the link below. If not, you'll just get some more information about some of the things that the anti-Josephites and the antagonists and the apologists, the anti-Josephites and the Brighamites argue on their side against us. So this is the family Bible of Melissa Lott's family. She was the oldest daughter of Cornelius and Premilia Lott. And you'll see it's really interesting. I dug into this a ton, so I'm going to try and zoom it in and let you see. At the top, it has the wedding, the initial wedding when Cornelius and Premilia got married. My speculation that it's easy to just assume this is that this was maybe a wedding gift and they recorded their marriage. Many years later, when the next entry was made that says Cornelius Lott married to Premilia Darrow for time and eternity, September the 20th, 1843 by President Hiram Smith with seal of President Joseph Smith. That's where it gets really interesting because right after that, it says September the 20th, C and P Lott, Cornelius Lott and Premilia Lott gave their daughter Melissa to wife. And so that's the damning evidence right there because they gave Melissa to wife that day, the day that they were sealed, and it doesn't have a groom listed. And then we have our narrative now of Joseph's secret polygamy. So his name couldn't be listed even in a family Bible because I guess that the mobbers were going around opening people's Bibles to find if anyone was married to Joseph. You know, like we have Heber and Brigham writing letters. We have William Clayton recording all of these things in his journal about his own self. And, we have all of these other things, but their family Bible had to not have Joseph's name in it is the scenario that we have based on this secret narrative. And then it becomes even more damning because on the next column at the top of it, you see it says Melissa Smith and lists her next wedding. So those two pieces of evidence look really bad. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. What is going on there? And sure enough, you dig in and those camels sure turned into shadows. So we're going to, let me explain a couple of things. The first things I think that are useful to do when trying to get to the bottom of this story. Two things that I did is first, actually look at the Bible, spend some time doing some basic analysis of it, both of handwriting and dates. And second, spend, 30 minutes to an hour, maybe less, researching the Lot family on Family Search. And all of a sudden, a whole new picture emerges, and it's quite amusing. Like, wow, this was something else. So, okay, first, before we go into the rest of that, I want to fill us in on who Melissa Lot was. I realize I might be doing a disservice to the people who aren't familiar with all of these arguments and haven't watched those episodes, because I'm just assuming people know what we're talking about. So if you don't, it's okay. Eventually you will, and this will all make more sense. But Melissa Lot claimed to be Joseph Smith's wife, right? And she's a really important one because she testified at the Temple Lot case. She wrote an affidavit. She's one of the few who, outrightly claim to have had sex with Joseph. And so she's an interesting one. So a couple of things. So I'm also planning a future episode on another one of the testimonies of women, but referring to the Temple Lot and to the other affidavits. Melissa's testimony is just filled with problems. It's actually kind of amusing to read it. It's just so reading through. Maybe I have my lenses on too big, but reading through her Temple Lot affidavit should be enough to convince anyone of the problems here. And I think that the judge, he really was being kind. The judge of the Temple Lot case, he was being kind when he says it perhaps would be uncharitable to say of these women that they have borne false testimony as to their connection with Joseph Smith. But in view of all the testimony, and then he basically says, well, it is difficult to escape the conclusion is part of what he says. So yeah, I've like Brian Hales talks about her in his video. Todd Compton talked about her in my interview, and they both just kind of say, we believe her. And I'm like, okay, I don't. And I like, let's discuss it. Let's talk about it, right? Let's go through her testimony and see why you think she's believable. So an interesting thing is it was her that Joseph Smith III, she was one, when Joseph Smith III came to Utah, Melissa Lot was one that he stopped and talked to, and they both gave very different reports of that meeting. Joseph Smith III printed his in the True Saints Herald, I believe it was called at that time. And so Melissa Lot came out with hers and sent it everywhere. And, and to me, it's so clear this story emerges of like, oh no, I have to fix this. And, that seems to be an ongoing theme that you have to get into the evidence more to see why I'm seeing that pattern. But it's definitely a pattern that I am seeing. And so I think that the things that are interesting to me about this interview, there are many things that are interesting and the differences between them, and I'll let you guys read them on your own. But when Joseph asks, do you have any evidence that you were married to my father? Melissa immediately goes and grabs the Bible and is like, look. And that's interesting to me, that it's not like, what could be evidence? Like, what could possibly be evidence of marriage? Well, first, a child, right? And then, any number of other things. But there's a Bible, and it's a really strategic, helpful Bible to prove this. And so I want to break this down a little bit, because they talk in Mormon discussions about how important the things are that aren't listed, like the name of the groom. I agree with them that it's very important to see the things that aren't listed. So let's look into a couple of those. The first entry I already went over. Let me see. I've got to find my place again because I went out of order. But okay, so I think that entry where they were sealed eternally could very well be legit. I have no idea. I think that if you examine it and look closely, you can see that where Melissa Lot is married, right under that, it's clearly different. There are some basic things you can see. The letters are a little bit closer together, but the most clear thing is the S. Check out the S's and how different those are, right? So that entry was not made at the same time by the same hand. I think it's pretty safe to say. As we go on from there, the entries get less and less detailed. The next one only says John Lot was married to Mary Fawcett, April the 8th. I had to go on Family Search to find the year because it's not listed in the Bible. That's really weird. It's really weird to leave the year of the marriage off. I'm not sure what that's about. And then there's just one more in that column. Mary Lot was married to Abraham Losi, November the 12th, 1848. That one lists the year. So remember those dates. They're important. April the 5th, and I looked up 1846, and then November the 12th, 1848. Then the top of the next column, in a brand new and much nicer hand in a completely different style, that also perfectly matches the next entry, is where it says, Melissa Smith was married to Ira Willis, May 13th, 1849. So, okay, a couple of things. By Melissa's own admission, as well as everything that we very well know, her own admission at the Temple Lot trial, she was never known as Melissa Smith. She never went by that name. None of the supposed wives ever took Joseph's last name. Now, in Utah, in real polygamy, that's very different. Even in Nauvoo, when they married polygamously, they took the name, right? I believe, I'm not sure about Nauvoo. I better not speak. I need to do that research, I'm realizing. But in Salt Lake, they absolutely did. In Utah, no polygamous wife ever went by Sister Smith. The only Sister Smith was Emma, right? So to name her sister Smith, Melissa Smith, is really weird just already. But it gets more interesting. So let's talk about the things that weren't recorded. There is Cornelius Lot's marriage to Elizabeth Durfee should be the next entry before the marriage of John. He took a second wife, Elizabeth Durfee, January 25th, 1846. So that should have been listed right after Melissa's groomless marriage. But maybe it wasn't something worth remembering. I think she was an older woman and they didn't have any children, and but that was apparently the marriage. But something far more important is also omitted, and that should have also been included before John's yearless marriage. So we have Melissa's groomless marriage, then John's yearless marriage. In between that, we are missing Cornelius's second marriage, and we're missing Melissa's second marriage. That should be listed right there. On February 8th, 1846, so before John's marriage, Melissa married. She became the seventh wife to the 47-year-old John Milton Bernheisel. And so she was Melissa Bernheisel. Very well established, very well known. She was married to John Bernheisel. We do have those records. And so that wasn't included in the Bible. That's interesting, right? We completely skip over a marriage and then we fraudulently list Melissa Lot Bernheisel. You could choose either of those. List her as Melissa Smith, a name that she never would have used at all, and certainly wouldn't have used after her marriage to John Bernheisel. However, it is very interesting that this happened. I want to also point out that these all could have been added at any point. There's no, by the time Melissa Smith, that marriage is recorded, that, these other marriages could have been added at any time. We don't know. But it's fraudulent to claim, look, the dates are listed, so we know it was listed then, because it's really important to note what is missing. That really matters. But the thing I find interesting is the potential reasons why this would have happened. Everything that I understand is that you had to be there's only one who holds the keys, right? So they had power to seal and also the power to unseal, as Brian Hales likes to say. So you had to get permission to get a divorce in this time period, from everything I have seen. So it's really interesting to consider what might be going on here. I don't know. Todd Compton tells us that Melissa's father was holding out for that there were some other people courting her that came to call, and he was rude to them and brushed them off because he was holding out for bigger keys. And so that's where John Bernheisel came in. It's hard to know how much of Todd Compton's book is fiction or historical, fact. It's not very clear to me. But in any case, it was not a happy marriage. She wanted out of it. And I can't help but wonder if part of the bargain, you can get out of this marriage and marry this other guy you like if we do this addition to your family Bible. Of course, purely speculative. I know I'm a big fat conspiracy theorist, so, who knows? But it's an interesting thing to consider. Why was this listed in the Bible? It looks to me like it was a very intentional effort to plant evidence, to create evidence that Melissa then knew to go immediately to get when she had to prove that she'd been married to Joseph Smith, right? And so I think it's interesting that she married Ira Willis the 13th of May, 1849. They had many children together, and that's the story with that. So I chalk that one. I mean, if you guys want to keep it in the pile of evidence of Joseph's polygamy, go ahead. To me, it pretty clearly just swapped over to the pile, the quickly growing pile of manufactured evidence. Okay, this is getting really long, so I'm going to skip over one, but I will do another video. I think I'm only going to cover maybe one or two more things, and then I'll have to save the rest for another video. But I really want to get into the deeds. The deeds are a really big one. And so let's, I know I should address Lucy Walker. I hate skipping over it, but we will get to it. Just the deeds were just like the Lot Bible. This was the other one that I dug into because I was like, whoa, how do I explain that? It's really getting fun to dig into these things. I'm not getting enough sleep, but I'm learning a lot. And so, so the claim is that Joseph gave many deeded land to his wife or to his wives. In any case, that the land deeded to women is evidence of his polygamy, right? That Joseph deeded land to women, therefore they were his wives, is how I interpret what they're meaning by this. So again, people hear this, how it's explained, and just take it as solid evidence, and then come against those of us who don't believe in Joseph's polygamy, and they're like, how can you deny this? There's so much. Well, let's dig into this piece now, right? So I confess I did not go through every single lot, every single deed. I said lot because I think I'm still on Melissa lot. And every single deed would have taken me way too long. I stayed up past 3 o'clock in the morning going into this. And so I, like I said, I've spent more time studying than I should have this last couple of days, but it actually was pretty fun. So what I wanted to see is, what is happening here? I wanted to get as much understanding of it as I could. I have not done anything like the comprehensive analysis that I would like to do because that would take a lot more time. But let me just tell you what I was able to see so far. First of all, there is way more land deeded to men than to women. I would say, I didn't count, it's somewhere between 10 to 1 and 50 to 1, maybe even more men to women that lots are deeded to, right? And we don't claim with all of those men that were deeded lots that there's some, that they were adopted and were Joseph's sons or anything like that. So I want to just set that off, that how this is like the polygamy lens. We already have accepted all of these other things. So now we're just looking to find more evidence to back it up, right? So then what I decided to do was to just look for the women. And like I said, I searched one part of one of the records, but I found a giant list of women who were deeded property who never were claimed to be Joseph's wives. So I'm going to go over the list, but this partial list I have so far, the thing I want to point out is you cannot find correlation here. You can't say the women that were deeded lots were Joseph Smith's wives and Joseph Smith's wives were deeded lots, right? It doesn't work either way. We should be able to say, okay, all of the women that were his wives were the women who got lots, and it should match up. It doesn't at all. It's kind of like, oh, we know that these women were living in Nauvoo, therefore they were Joseph Smith's wives, right? Like it just doesn't match. It's not a fit. And since they were Joseph Smith's wives, they were living in Nauvoo. So that's evidence that they were his wives, right? Like there were lots of women living in Nauvoo. So there were lots of women in these land deeds. And we have these later claims about several of them. So let me go through the partial list I found so far going through it. There is land deeded to Sally Allred, Mary Ann Price, Elizabeth Matthews. The two that I found that were claimed to be wives were Patty and Sylvia Sessions. Those were the only ones that I have found so far. And I do want to point out that at least, is it Sylvia, is we know that she lied. I'm sorry. I know that that's a hard thing to say. She told her daughter Josephine that that Joseph was her father. And I do not have much patience at all for the claim, well, she didn't know who the father was, as if she was committing adultery and sleeping with both of these men. And she didn't tell her, Joseph might be your father. She told her, Joseph is your father, and Joseph wasn't her father. So we already, can kind of know that they're not the most... they don't have the best case to be wives, because Josephine was the best case to be one of Joseph's children. Let's see. I'll go on. Amanda H. Hartson, Cynthia Durfee, Sarah Ann Billings, Roxina Sophia Billings, Marianne Bosley, Lovina Murphy, Elizabeth Matthews, Mary J. and C.L. Smith, Julia M. Smith. That's Joseph's and Emma's daughter. She was deeded 4 lots. So what does that say about her, right? Come on. And then Sarah Foster, Janetta Richards, Harriet Parker, Lucy Smith, that's Joseph's mother, Polly Sherwood, Elizabeth Ann Whitney. By this time, after researching each of these women, because I had to research each of them and see who they were, how they were connected, were they wives, right? So that's where I stopped, because it says in my notes it was after 3 a.m. But that is the point I wanted to make. First off, there's not any kind of correlation. It is really ludicrous to use this in any way as evidence of marriage. And so I think it's more useful to investigate, to try to understand what might be going on here, right? What are these deeds about? Why were the deeds left to who they were? And why were deeds left to women at all? Especially, I thought it was interesting because one of the panelists pointed out repeatedly that women couldn't hold property without their husband, as if, I'm not even sure if that panelist understood the point they were trying to make, because all of the women who were Joseph's supposed wives, who were deeded property, were not married to Joseph legally, so they couldn't hold property legally. Like I don't understand the point with that thing that was said frequently. I think it is interesting to try to understand why Joseph was deeding lots, especially to women. And as we get into it more, I think that it becomes, a possibility emerges that seems more plausible to me than ignoring all of the rest of this, not trying to understand or explain any of it, and just going, oh, some of the women that were deeded lots claim to be married to Joseph, so therefore it's evidence of Joseph's polygamy. Those are some thick polygamy lenses, in my opinion. And so also I think that it's pretty thick, anti-Josephite lenses to claim that these were some sort of shady deals. That's the other thing that they're saying. And I think that to look at Joseph's, the work that Joseph did with the church, to look at that as some sort of a money-making scheme is just sadly lacking of critical thought and information. For example, that Joseph was in bankruptcy court when he died. They pointed this out in the podcast, that all of the debts were listed to Joseph personally, which means that they would go on to Emma and Joseph III, which they did. And all of the assets were held by the church, which is just not a very financially prudent thing to do if your goal is to use the church to enrich yourself, right? It's not what L. Ron Hubbard would do, for example. So I think, anyway, let's get into this, because I think that the other thing that really did throw me for a loop were the land deeds to Emma. I was like, oh yeah, I've been aware of this, but I haven't really dug in and considered and said what's going on there. And so that's what I wanted to do, and I want to share. And again, I'm not trying to convince anybody. I'm trying to let you see what I see, and so that you can understand it a little bit better, right? So first of all, I was going to go into the issues with the journals, with what we call journals. Again, a tricky word, because it implies something that is not the case with any of these records. But our entire interpretation of the land deeds, in all of them to the women, but in particular these given to Emma, are all subject to the narrative created, in my opinion, by William Clayton and Willard Richards, mainly William Clayton. And so I think that that's something to consider. If we can recognize, okay, like I said, I was going to go through a bunch of the reasons that I don't trust that, but I think we're all probably exhausted. So I'm going to save that for another time and just tell you that I think that there are very good reasons to hold those with a lot of skepticism. So if we can step away and just look at the land deeds and consider what might be going on, and then we can consider the two scenarios. One, all I can do is speculate about some other possibilities, but we can still say what's more possible, what's more plausible, right? And so, okay, the first thing, so for anyone who's not caught up, who hasn't watched the other one, our claim is that on July 12th, 1843, that's the day that Joseph got that he revealed section 132. Hiram showed it to Emma. She ripped it up or burned it, I think, right? And then there was all of this dealing. And then on that same day, Joseph deeded all of the unencumbered lots to Emma. And so we're going to look into that. And then on the next day, we'll get into that as well. The next day, it says that in the journal, it has some other things listed, but it says that he spent the entire day with Emma. So our claim is that Emma was going to divorce him. I think, if I understand it correctly, because it's not perfectly clear to me, but like in a desperate attempt to keep her from divorcing him, he gave her all the property. Is that what it is? Someone can clarify that for me, because I think it's basically just like, and not really thought through as clearly, at least that I have understood. So that's how I understand the issue. So I want to dig into it and see what happens if we take away Clayton's claim of what happened on August 13th, right? So the first thing I think we should consider is that this is not the first time or the only time that Joseph deeded property to Emma. If you see right here, there is a deed that is to Emma Smith on the 13th of June, 1842. And that's really interesting. So we could look at that with our polygamy lenses and say, he must have made her mad, and that set the precedent to give her property when she was mad at him, because we'll get into that in a minute. But anyway, I think that if you dig into the records, it's a different thing emerges right here, right? So Joseph's journal for these days is a mess. It's all a lot of blank days and a lot of days that don't match up with other dates. But if you get into the Relief Society minutes, on June 9th, it says President Smith then said that he would give a lot of land to the society, that the society may build houses for the poor. And so that's interesting. It says that in the notes. 4 days later, this deed is given to Emma, who's the president of the Relief Society, right? So I think that explains that pretty neatly. And so we can dig in and see, there could be innocent reasons for these things to be done, right? So if we look now back to, a couple of points I think I already just pointed out, that it took 4 days to get that done, right? It was set on the 9th, and it took until the 13th to get the deed, which I think is in keeping. That's actually pretty fast for like that kind of official work to be done to get a land deed, right? And so let's go back to now 1843. I agree that something was happening leading up to July 12th, 1843. The question is, what was it? And can we know? And do we have any other information? And so anyway, these are the records that we have for that day in Joseph's journal kept by Willard Richards, that we call a journal, right? It says Wednesday, July 12th, received a revelation in the office in the presence of Hiram Smith and William Clayton. And then it leaves 7 lines blank. And then it says, this PM, George J. Adams and David S. Hollister returned from Springfield. And then it says G.L. Wiley called for an interview. So I want to talk about Joseph's day this day, right? And what he had time to accomplish on this day. So he's having an interview in the morning he's meeting in the morning, and Hiram's begging him to get the revelation, according to William Clayton. So he reveals this long revelation, has William Clayton read it back to him, approves it, right? They've decided to do it. So that's quite a bit of time right there, right? And then Hiram takes the revelation, reads it to Emma. There's that hullabaloo, right? And then Joseph would have to spend a lot of time talking to Emma, working this out, I would think, to come up with the resolution of land deeds will solve the problem somehow. somehow that fixes polygamy. I don't know how, or that she's going to divorce him and he's like, oh, you're going to divorce me. Okay, then take all of the church property so that you could divorce me. I don't understand that either, right? And so, and then also anyone who has, anyone who's married, we've all had struggles to work out, but these things I have not had anything even approaching the vicinity of this hard in my marriage. And yet still, these conversations take sometimes days, at least hours and hours. And so he had time to do all of these other things in his journal and then go have these hard conversations with Emma, come up with the resolution that it would be land deeds, then still have time to go to the land deed office. I guess maybe it was just downstairs in the brick store, wherever it was, but go find who they needed to do land deeds and have all of those. It's if you read the deed, it is complicated. They had to get into the book, figure out every lot, list it individually, right? And get that all signed, sealed, written up. They did that all in one day. That's like amazing. That's amazing. And then it was the next day in the journal that it says, spent most of the day talking to Emma. I'll have to find where that is. But it says Joseph did a couple of other things and then spent most of the time he spent talking to Emma. So they resolve it on the 12th. They didn't really have time to talk. It was too busy of a day, but they came up with a resolution to do the land deeds. That's done. And then the next day they spend talking all day. And also keep in mind, this is a polygamist man, right? Remember, we've talked about the polygamist mindset. So can you see why I have some questions here? Why I think that Clayton's and Willard's narrative might be dubious, right? Especially, I've shown you the previous list of the record of altering records, right? And so I think that there might be something else going on here. So, here it is. I in conversation with Emma most of the day is what it said the next day. So again, they had their long, difficult conversation after the land deeds were done. Maybe you can help me understand. Maybe I'm kind of dense. I mean, I have been married for a long time, but maybe there's another way to view this that I don't see. It's not making a lot of sense to me. And so again, and the more you study of Emma and Joseph, like we have to get out of the mindset of the crazy Emma that pushed Eliza down the stairs and tried to poison Joseph, and the crazy Joseph who had to slap Emma across the face to get her to stop screaming at him. Like, this was not who these people were, according to anything that anyone ever said about them. And so, including Joseph Smith III, who was 11 when his father died. You're old enough at 11 to know if your parents were screaming at each other all the time, right? But also look at Lucy's what she said about Emma, right? They weren't these crazy people that Brigham painted them to be. I just really don't think so. So I think that another thing that is important to recognize is that there's a critical difference between these two affidavits, the one done in 42 and the one done in 43. The second one that's done in 43 isn't just to Emma. The wording is almost identical in the two deeds, just the one in 43 is way longer because it's not just one lot, it's a lot of lots and lots of lots. And so this is the wording. It says, the second deed doth hereby grant, bargain, sell, convey, and confirm unto the said Emma Smith, Julia M. Smith, Joseph Smith Jr., Frederick G. W. Smith, and Alexander Smith, their heirs and assigns forever against the, and then at the end, against the claims or the claim or claims of all and every person whomsoever do and will warrant and forever defend by these presents, in testimony whereof the said Joseph Smith party of the first part hath hereunto set his hand and seal. So the first deed was only to Emma. The second one was to Emma and all of Emma's and Joseph's children. That's really interesting as well. So I think that I can only speculate. I can't prove anything, but we do know, as I said, the debts were in Joseph's name, the properties were in the church's name. We don't know what might have been happening, but we do know that there were false brethren. There was all of this rhetoric happening. There are people that had become enemies, people that had left the church. They already also had experienced the horrors of Missouri, been chased off of their land, had so many of the men killed at Hans Mill. It is easy for me to see here an effort to protect the women and the children, an effort to try to make it so that if the men were killed or arrested, the women could hopefully keep their properties and not have them taken from them. I see a real effort to protect Emma and her children. When I read these land deeds, I don't see division and strife. I see unity and care from everything I know. If we take out, and again, don't straw man to say that they say don't listen to anything after Joseph's life. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying all we have is Clayton's account of what happened here and Willard's, I think, manufactured journal to try to back it up, right? If you look at the church history, the narrative that was put, it uses it uses Willard Richard's journal, but then adds the entire revelation and pretends that was the original journal. So we know that they did this, right? So that's I think a much better interpretation, especially when you consider it would take a while to get these land deeds prepared. It couldn't have been done in a late afternoon, as was the only time that would have been available on this busy day. I don't think it could have been prepared that quickly. I think that there had been maybe some warnings, some fear for Joseph's life, some fear of what the brethren were doing. We know that there were things happening all around. So anyway, that's my interpretation of this. And then I think the next day spent in conversation makes so much more sense when you're trying to plan and decide what to do with these lots that you've been given and what to do in different circumstances. So anyway, I'm going to move on. I had more to say on that, but this is getting long and it is getting late. So I think that is much more in keeping with also, okay, I have to say it again. I keep saying it, but we need to come back to the polygamist mindset. A polygamous man does not deed all of his property to any of his wives, let alone his first wife. If he's going to give any property away, it's going to be to the woman he's trying to woo or to his newest favorite wife, like Brigham Young with Amelia's palace, right? There are plenty of examples we can give. Joseph's pattern doesn't fit. It doesn't work for a polygamist man in any way. And so then I just want to point something else out about the different, just to look at which is more plausible, right? This point of a polygamous mindset is really important. They would never allow a woman to have this much influence on them. So here are just a few things from Brigham that he taught. For a man to follow a woman is in the sight of heaven disgraceful to the name of man. That's the Complete Discourses of Brigham Young, Volume 3, page 441. And here he says, I can show you, wife, where to put everything in your house. And then on the next page, when the servants of God in any age have consented to follow a woman for a leader, either in a public or a family capacity, they have sunk beneath the standard that their organization fitted them for. When a people of God submit to that their priesthood is taken from them and they become as any other people. I shall humor the wife as far as I can consistently. And if you have any crying to do, wife, you can do that along with your children, for I have none of that kind of business to do. Let our wives be the weaker vessels and the men be men, and show the women by their superior ability that God gives husbands wisdom and ability to lead their wives into his presence. Are you getting a sense of what I'm talking about, right? And this is part of why I don't want Joseph blamed for Brigham's crimes and sins. It is so clear to me what is happening. And I think it's a big problem that we let Brigham off the hook when we attribute all of this to Joseph and then don't really look at Brigham because we claim that he's just following in the footsteps. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. We also know that Joseph really relied on Emma, as I've already talked about, and that Brigham blamed Emma for Joseph's death and blamed Joseph for listening too much to Emma, right? They had a really different mindset, a really different paradigm. And that quote I just read of Brigham's, I want to quickly compare it to something that Joseph brought forth, right? Jacob 2:31 and 32. For behold, I, the Lord, have seen the sorrow and heard the mourning of the daughters of my people in the land of Jerusalem, yea, and in all the lands of my people, because of the wickedness and abomination of their husbands. And I will not suffer, saith the Lord of hosts, that the cries of the fair daughters of this people, which I have led out of the land of Jerusalem, shall come up unto me against the men of my people, saith the Lord of hosts. There's more I was going to read, but Joseph brought that forward. Those are not the scriptures that a polygamous man would bring forward. And then I'm too exhausted to cover every topic. It's just too much. So I hope you can see I have gone as systematically as I can through them, not avoided any of them. And I hope that I have at least given you a view. I hope that at the very least you can have a little more respect for people who have come to find the monogamy glasses to be a better fit. I am happy to continuing to engage in conversation. I'm happy to come and have a conversation with anyone. I wanted the chance to spell things out in a more methodical way. It takes a lot of time, as you can see. But I want to really quickly, so let me just say the rest of my list. What do I have? Leonard Sobey, the High Council minutes, the laws and the expositors. Yeah, all of those issues. I want to address the rest of those. I just think it would be more prudent to do it a different time. I think maybe, I'll save William Marks as well. There's a really easy answer for William Marks. So anyway, that's all I can fit for now, because I think it's really late and this has gone really long. I hope it has been useful. Please don't judge the totality of the argument on this side by whatever I might lack in this one presentation that I tried really hard to put together in a few days. It was a lot of work and I'm doing it by myself and I have a ton of kids at home. So anyway, all of my excuses. I don't mean that. I want to open a dialogue, not make myself an object of ridicule. And I do feel that danger. So I want to address it. I also want to say, Bill, you issued what sounded like a sincere invitation to engage with people who watched your episode and what you considered to be sort of a, steel lock case and still aren't convinced. And I'm not convinced. And so I would love to continue to engage and hear more thoughts. And, that's right. That's what I think is valuable. I really do think when we engage with people who disagree with us, we find more truth. Usually being the underdog helps you be much more thorough in your research, right? Because you've got to knock down the big tower, what everybody already knows to be true. And so that's what hopefully we can gain here, is all of us can learn more and learn more how to see what other people are seeing. I think it's useful. So anyway, I'm going to just end with this one last picture that I love. This is also from Brain Games, and I just think it's so good. And right, this is so obvious. Of course, we can all see it. We don't have the full picture, but we don't need it to see what it says because our brains can fill in the rest. But I want to point out that we have half of this picture. We have way less than half of the picture of polygamy. We have just a little bit that we are trying to find. So we can't be too quick to jump to conclusions. Let me play this little clip.
So, if this sentence doesn't say jumping to conclusions, then what does it say?
Let me reveal what's there. You'll see it's... Our brain is really good at working with limited information to try to understand what might be out there. Of course, sometimes it makes mistakes.
So again, that's where I'm going to leave it. I want to thank all of you for staying tuned this long. I really appreciate it. And I will see you next time.